The morning Silas Whitmore threw Maribel's belongings into the mud, he was smiling. Not the tight, uncomfortable smile of a man doing something he knew was wrong. A real smile. Wide and satisfied, like a man who had just solved a problem that had been annoying him for months. He tossed her sewing basket first, then the small wooden box where she kept her late husband's letters, then her winter coat, which landed in a puddle near the gate and soaked through before she could even reach for it. "You have until sundown," he said. "After that, anything left is mine." Maribel stood in the yard holding her sheepdog Bruno by the collar, not because he might run, but because she needed something to hold on to. And she looked at this man who had never once called her by her name, not in 3 years of marriage into his family, and she made herself a promise so quiet that even Bruno couldn't hear it. He will regret this day. She just didn't know yet how right she was. If you've ever been thrown away by someone who was supposed to protect you, stay with me, because what Maribel did next is going to surprise you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because stories like this one don't come through your feed twice. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and don't go anywhere. This is only the beginning. The day Maribel Rowan became a widow, it rained so hard the funeral had to be cut short. The preacher said a few words over Thomas's grave, then people scattered under their hats and buggy covers and disappeared back into their warm homes, and Maribel was left standing in the mud in a black dress that hadn't fit her properly since before the wedding, holding an umbrella that had bent the wrong way in the wind. She was 29 years old. She had $43 to her name, a sheepdog named Bruno, and a marriage that had lasted less than 4 years. Thomas Whitmore had been a decent man, not extraordinary, not the kind of husband poets write about, but decent. He'd never mocked her weight, which in a town like Harrow's Creek, where women were expected to be as lean as the cattle they helped raise, was not as small a thing as it sounds. He'd said once, early in their courtship, that he liked that she was solid, and she'd understood what he meant and chose not to be offended by the phrasing. He meant she was real, substantial, not the kind of woman who might blow away. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. She almost blew away anyway, just not from wind. The trouble started before the funeral flowers had wilted on the grave. Silas Whitmore, Thomas's father, a man whose boots cost more than most families in Harrow's Creek spent on food in a month, came to the small house Maribel and Thomas had rented on the edge of his property and sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. He put his hat on the table, which Thomas had always told her was bad manners, and he looked at Maribel the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's already decided to sell. "I'll need you out by end of month," he said. Maribel was still wearing the black dress. She hadn't changed because she hadn't felt like moving, and because some part of her thought that if she sat still long enough, the last week might unhappen itself. She had a cup of tea in front of her that had gone cold. "Excuse me," she said. "The house is on my land." Silas folded his hands on the table like a man at a business meeting. "Thomas is gone. You have no claim to property. End of month is generous." Maribel looked at her cold tea. She thought about Thomas, who had been sick for almost a year before the end came, who had spent his last weeks telling her everything was going to be fine, that his family would look after her. He'd believed that. He'd really believed it. "Thomas told me," she started. "Thomas is dead." Silas said it without cruelty. That was almost worse. "What he told you is not a legal document. End of month." He picked up his hat and left. Maribel sat at the table for a long time after that. Bruno came and put his big, warm head in her lap, which was the most comfort she received that entire week. She spent the next 3 weeks quietly panicking. She wrote a letter to the county clerk asking about widows' rights to marital property. She received a reply that was polite and essentially useless. She asked 2 of Thomas's cousins if they knew anything about his estate. Both of them looked away when they answered, which told her everything she needed to know about what Silas had already said to them in private. By the end of the 3rd week, she had $20 left. The funeral had taken the rest. She wasn't a woman who cried easily. Her mother had raised 4 children on a failing farm and had operated on the principle that tears were a luxury you could afford after the chores were done. Maribel had inherited this without quite meaning to, but the night before she was supposed to leave the house, she sat in the dark with Bruno's head on her knee and she cried for about 20 minutes, ugly, undignified crying, the kind that makes your face hurt afterward. And then she stopped and thought about what she was going to do next. The answer came from the most unexpected place. There was a man in Harrow's Creek named Pell. Nobody used his first name, or if they did, Maribel had never heard it. He was old, maybe 70, and he ran a trading post on the far edge of town that sold everything from boots to fence wire, and he had a reputation for knowing about land. Not in the way a banker knows about land, as numbers and titles and assessments, but the way a man knows a place he's lived in for 50 years. Maribel had bought flour and salt from him a dozen times. He'd always been decent to her, which in Harrow's Creek meant he looked her in the eye when he spoke and didn't comment on her size. She went to see him 2 days before she had to leave the house, because she had no other ideas. "I've got $20, she said, not bothering with preamble. "I need to not be homeless." Pell looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You ever hear of Raven Bluff?" She hadn't. "Nobody wants it," he said. "Been on the county books for 6 years. Rocky. No water anyone can see. The man who owned it before tried to run cattle on it and quit after 1 season." He paused. "There's a cave." "A cave?" "Big one. Goes back maybe 40 feet, maybe more. I never went past the entrance. Used to be a spring in there, county records say. Might still be." He shrugged. "Might be nothing." "How much?" "County's asking 25. But the county's been asking 25 for 6 years, and nobody's moved on it. You offer them 20 in cash before some lawyer gets involved, they'll take it." Maribel thought about this. $20 was everything she had. If she spent it on a piece of land that turned out to be genuinely worthless, she would be both homeless and broke, which was strictly worse than just homeless. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Pell looked at her again, and this time there was something behind his eyes that might have been respect or might have been pity, and she couldn't quite tell the difference. "Because you came in here and didn't cry," he said, "and because Thomas Whitmore was a decent man and his father is not." She bought the land the next morning. The county clerk had clearly been expecting to see a man because he looked past Maribel twice when she came into the office, and then when she set the $20 on his desk and told him what she was there for, he picked up the bills and held them up to the light like he suspected they might be counterfeit. "Raven Bluff," he said, with the particular tone of voice people reserve for things that don't deserve to be taken seriously. "That's right. You know there's no water access from the main creek." "I know. The topsoil's mostly shale. Nothing grows there. I'm not planning to farm it." He looked at her, at all of her, the way men sometimes did, cataloging her size the way you might note a liability on a balance sheet, and he stamped the papers. She walked out of the county clerk's office with a deed in her hand and nothing else. The morning Silas came to make sure she was leaving, he didn't throw her things into the mud right away. He gave her what he probably thought was a reasonable amount of time, which was about 4 minutes of watching her load Bruno and her 2 suitcases into the small cart she'd borrowed from Pell, and then something in his patience ran out. The sewing basket went first, then the box with Thomas's letters, then the coat. "You have until sundown," he said. "After that, anything left is mine." Maribel picked up the coat. It was wet through already, but she wrung it out and folded it and put it on top of her suitcase. She picked up Thomas's letters, which had fanned out across the mud, and she gathered them one by one and put them back in the box. She did not look at Silas again. She heard him say something behind her, something about how she should have thought about the future before she let herself go, which was the kind of thing men like Silas said when they wanted to make themselves feel better about what they were doing. She didn't respond. She climbed onto the cart beside Bruno and picked up the reins. 3 women were watching from across the road. She recognized 2 of them, wives of men who worked for Silas. They weren't cruel women exactly. They just looked at her the way people look at a wagon with a broken wheel, with a kind of second-hand embarrassment and no intention of helping. She drove past them without speaking. The road to Raven Bluff was about 4 miles out of town, and it earned its name. The land rose sharply toward a ridge of dark rock, the kind of rock that looks like it has been angry for a long time and hasn't entirely forgiven the world for it. The scrub brush was sparse and grayish. There were no trees to speak of, just a few stubborn juniper bushes growing sideways out of the rock face like they'd given up on growing upward. Bruno sat beside her on the cart and watched everything with his ears forward and his nose working. He was a big dog, part sheepdog, part something else that nobody had ever identified, with rough gray and white fur and the kind of calm intelligence that makes you trust an animal more than you trust most people. He had been Thomas's dog first, but somewhere in the last year of Thomas's illness, he had transferred his loyalty to Maribel with the quiet finality of a decision that couldn't be revisited. She was glad to have him. The cave entrance was not immediately obvious, which was probably why nobody had wanted the land. It sat at the base of the ridge, half hidden behind a tumble of large flat rocks that had to be walked around before you could see the actual opening. But when Maribel climbed down from the cart and made her way around the rocks, she stopped. It was bigger than she'd expected, not enormous, not the kind of cave that shows up in adventure stories with underground rivers and stalactite cathedrals, but big enough. The entrance was maybe 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, and it went back far enough that she couldn't see the end of it from where she stood. The air coming out of it was cool and smelled of mineral water and something old, the way places smell when they haven't been disturbed for a long time. Bruno walked in ahead of her, sniffed the walls, sneezed, and looked back at her with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, it's a cave." "I know," she said. She spent the first hour just walking the interior with a lantern, measuring with her steps, noting where the walls were solid and where they showed cracks, looking at the ceiling and the floor and the back wall. The cave went back about 45 feet before the ceiling dropped low enough that she would have had to crawl to go further. In the middle of the back section, she found what Pell had mentioned, a small spring, barely a trickle, coming up through a crack in the stone floor and running along a natural channel in the rock before disappearing back under the wall. She knelt beside it, put her fingers in the water. It was cold and clean, and it was running, which meant it wasn't stagnant, which meant it was probably safe. She sat back on her heels and looked at that trickle of water for a long time. $20. Everything she had. For a rocky hillside that nobody wanted and a cave that nobody thought was worth anything. She touched the stone floor with her palm and felt the cold of it come up through her hand. She had been a carpenter's daughter, briefly a carpenter's helper, before her father's back gave out, and she'd had to take on other work. She knew how to use a saw. She knew how to drive a nail. She knew that most things people think are impossible are really just things that would take longer than most people are willing to spend. She stood up, dusted her hands on her skirt, and went back to the cart to get her tools. What she had was limited. One hammer, one handsaw, a small bag of nails she'd bought with the last of the money Pell had lent her, which she would need to pay back by spring, a coil of rope, a canvas tarp, enough dried food for 2 weeks if she was careful, 3 wool blankets, and a piece of land that the county had been trying to give away for 6 years. She started with the most pressing problem, which was that the cave entrance let in wind from the northwest, and the nights were already cold, and they would get colder. She spent the first afternoon dragging flat rocks from the ridge and stacking them into a low windbreak at the cave entrance, not to block the opening entirely, because she needed air and light, but angled enough to redirect the worst of the wind. It was hard work. The rocks were heavier than they looked, and the footing on the hillside was poor, and twice she slipped and skinned her palms. By the time the sun was going down, she had something that looked less like a windbreak and more like a pile of rocks with intentions, and her shoulders were burning and her back hurt and she was hungry. She ate a little dried meat and some hardtack, gave Bruno a portion, and lay down on 2 of the 3 blankets with the third pulled over her, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of the cave. She thought about Silas Whitmore's face when he'd thrown her coat into the mud. She thought about Thomas, who would have been horrified and would have said something gentle and useless about how his father didn't mean it that way. She thought about the women watching from across the road, with their second-hand embarrassment and their careful, uninvolved eyes. She thought about the county clerk holding her $20 up to the light. And then she stopped thinking about all of them and started thinking about the spring. If the spring ran all year, and springs at this depth in this kind of rock generally did, she had water. Water. If she had water, she could keep animals. Sheep were her best option. They didn't need as much space as cattle. They produced wool as well as meat, and they were hardy enough to manage on the scrubby vegetation along the ridge if she could supplement it. She'd need a pen. She'd need to find a ram and at least a few ewes. She'd need feed for the first winter until they established a grazing pattern. She had no money for any of this. But Pell, she remembered, had said he sometimes traded supplies for future labor. And there was a woman named Garrity out on the eastern road who'd been known to sell off older ewes in the fall, rather than winter them over. And if she could get the pen built before the cold really set in, Bruno shifted beside her and sighed the deep, satisfied sigh of a dog who has decided the sleeping arrangement is acceptable. Maribel closed her eyes. She was cold. Her palms stung. Her back hurt. She was lying on a stone floor in a cave on a piece of land everybody thought was worthless, and she had 32 cents in her pocket and no plan that went past the next 3 days. She thought, I have been colder than this. I have had less than this. I have survived worse than this man's opinion of me. She wasn't sure if that was true, but she had learned from her mother that sometimes you tell yourself something enough times and it becomes true. The same way you can hammer a bent nail straight if you're patient enough and know which direction to hit. Outside the cave, the wind came off the ridge and swept down across the valley. Inside the cave, Maribel Rowan slept. In the morning, she started to build. The first thing she discovered was that the flat, shale-heavy ground outside the cave entrance was actually more stable than it looked, if you cleared the loose surface rock. She spent an entire morning doing nothing but moving rock, a job that required no skill and a great deal of stubbornness, which she had in abundance. By noon, she had a rough cleared area about 20 feet wide in front of the cave entrance, level enough to work on. She built the sheep pen from the first load of timber she traded Pell for. 3 days of organizing his back stock room, which was a job he'd been avoiding for 2 years. The pen wasn't pretty, the posts weren't perfectly spaced, and one corner leaned about 10 degrees further south than it should have. But it was solid, and when she pushed against the rails to test them, they held. She went back to town for the ewes on a Saturday morning in late October, driving Pell's cart because she didn't have her own. She had arranged through Pell to buy 3 older ewes from Garrity. Older, meaning they were past their peak breeding years, but still healthy, still producing, still warm enough on the inside that they'd make it through a winter with proper shelter. She got them cheap because most buyers wanted younger animals, and also because Garrity was a practical woman who looked at Maribel and her cart and her plan and said, "You built a pen in a cave?" And when Maribel said yes, Garrity said, "All right then," and loaded the ewes without further comment. That was the closest thing to encouragement Maribel received in those first weeks. Harrow's Creek, for its part, was not encouraging. The story of what she'd done with her $20 had gotten around quickly. Small towns have excellent information networks, even if most of what they carry is wrong. The version that circulated was that Maribel Whitmore, she had started using her maiden name again, Rowan, but people in town hadn't caught up yet, had spent her dead husband's money on a hole in the ground out past the ridge and was living in it like an animal. She heard this secondhand from Pell, who told it to her in the flat, recitative way of a man passing along information he thinks you should have. "Are they saying anything else?" she asked. "Some people say you'll be back in town begging by December." "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think you've got 3 ewes and a pen and a spring that runs. I've seen men start ranches with less. But not women." "No," he agreed. "Not women." She drove back to Raven Bluff with the ewes crowded together in the back of the cart, and Bruno trotting alongside doing his herding work even though they were technically in a vehicle, because that's the kind of dog he was, dedicated to the function even when the context had changed. It was getting dark by the time she got the ewes settled in the pen, checked the water channels she'd built to redirect the spring drip into a trough, and made sure the windbreak on the pen side was solid. She stood at the cave entrance and watched the last light go out of the sky and thought about December. She thought about the women across the road. She thought about Silas Whitmore's smile. She thought about 32 cents and 3 sheep and a cave and a piece of land that had cost $20. She thought, by December, I'll have more than this. And somewhere in the dark behind her, one of the ewes made a soft, complaining sound, and Bruno went to check on it, and Maribel Rowan walked back into her cave to work on the cabin she was going to build inside it, which was the part of the plan nobody in Harrow's Creek had heard yet, because nobody had thought to ask what a woman who had grown up in a carpenter's house might know how to do. They were all too busy being certain she was going to fail to wonder what she might actually know. That mistake was going to cost them. The cabin inside the cave was not her idea originally. It had come to her the 3rd night, when the wind off the ridge found a gap she hadn't accounted for in her rock windbreak, and came through the cave entrance at an angle that cut straight through her blankets and made Bruno press his warm weight against her back in the middle of the night. She lay there listening to it and thinking about the problem the way her father had taught her to think about problems, not as obstacles, but as questions. This question was not, how do I survive this cold? The question was, where does the cold come from and how do I stop it at the source? The cave itself stayed warmer than outside. That was basic geology, something she'd understood without ever needing to be taught it formally. The earth holds heat, and a deep enough cave holds more than the surface does. The problem was the entrance, which let in everything the ridge threw at it. What she needed was a barrier between the cold entrance and where she slept and worked. Not a door exactly. A door required hinges and precision, but something that broke the air before it reached her. She started building the cabin frame 4 days after she got the ewes settled, using timber she'd gotten from Pell against 2 more days of labor. She built it 20 feet back from the entrance, which meant it sat in the part of the cave where the ceiling was high enough to stand under and the air was still and cool without being brutal. She had never built a full room before, only helped her father with frameworks and rough walls, but she understood the principle. 4 walls, a roof that ties them together, gaps filled with whatever you have. She used clay from the spring margin to fill the gaps between planks. It cracked when it dried, and she filled the cracks again. She did this 4 times before she accepted that the clay fill method had limitations and started stuffing the remaining gaps with dried moss from the ridge, which held better. The roof was the hardest part. She had no good way to create a proper peak inside the cave, so she made a slanted flat roof instead, angled slightly so that condensation from the cave ceiling above would run toward the back wall rather than drip onto her bed. She'd seen the drip patterns on the cave ceiling and planned around them, which felt clever until she lay awake the first night in the finished cabin listening to the drips hit the roof in exactly the places she'd predicted, and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not quite pride, because pride felt too light for it. Something more solid. Something that had to do with having been right about something when everyone expected her to be wrong about everything. The inside of the cabin was small, maybe 12 feet by 10 feet, and low-ceilinged enough that she had to be careful about her posture near the walls. She had a sleeping pallet on a raised wooden frame so the cold from the stone floor didn't seep up through the night. She had a small iron stove, her single most expensive acquisition, bought on credit from Pell's trading post against future wool, which she had no wool yet to back up, but which Pell accepted because he had decided, in his quiet way, that she was good for it. The stovepipe went up through a gap she'd carefully chipped in the cave roof over several days, using the iron spikes she'd found in the original tools she'd bought, working in half-hour sessions because her arms gave out past that. The gap wasn't elegant. The pipe tilted about 8 degrees off vertical, but it drew, and the smoke went out, and the stove put heat into the small space in a way that made the cabin feel like an entirely different world from the cold cave entrance 30 feet away. Bruno approved of the stove. He positioned himself in front of it every evening with the careful satisfaction of an animal that has made a good decision and knows it. November came in gray and suspicious. The days got shorter, and the light that reached the back of the cave by mid-afternoon was thin and angled, more suggestion than substance. Maribel developed a routine that she held to not because she was particularly disciplined by nature, but because routine was the only thing that kept the loneliness manageable. She was up before first light. She fed the ewes, checked the water trough, checked the pen fencing for any overnight shifts in the ground that might have weakened a post. She ate, usually porridge on the stove, occasionally dried meat if she was especially hungry, which she often was because the work burned more than she could comfortably afford to put back. She did not let herself think too hard about the food situation. She thought about it just enough to be careful and not enough to be frightened. After morning chores, she worked on whatever the current problem was. In early November, the current problem was the pen's western wall, which she'd built with slightly too much space between rails, and which she discovered was a problem when one of the ewes, the smallest one, a gray animal she'd started calling stubborn for reasons that quickly became self-evident, put her head through the gap and then couldn't get it back out without assistance. Maribel spent 40 minutes on a cold morning talking to a panicking sheep and working the animal's head free from the rail gap, and afterward she sat on the ground with Stubborn's considerable weight leaning against her and said, to nobody, "I need to fix that rail." She fixed the rail. There were days when things went wrong in several directions at once, which she'd learned was the nature of frontier work. Not that problems happened, but that they clustered. One week in mid-November, the spring ran slower than usual, which made the trough fill at a rate that wasn't quite keeping pace with 3 sheep's daily consumption. She spent 2 days investigating the spring before she realized that a flat rock had shifted and was partially blocking the underground channel that fed it. Moving the rock took her the better part of an afternoon, and she did it by herself with a pry bar she'd fashioned from a length of iron rod, working in the cold dark at the back of the cave where the spring emerged. And when the water finally ran free and strong again, she sat back on her heels and let herself feel something that was not quite happiness, but was in the same neighborhood. What she missed most was not comfort. It was not warmth or food, or even another person to talk to, though she missed all of those things. What she missed most was being seen accurately. In her marriage, Thomas had seen her accurately, more or less, had understood that she was capable and stubborn and practical, and had valued those things even when they made her difficult to live with. Since Thomas died, nobody had looked at her and seen what was actually there. What they saw was a fat widow with no money and no prospects, and they had formed their conclusions from that and stopped looking. She talked to Bruno about this sometimes. In the evenings when the stove was warm and the sheep were quiet in their pen and the wind moved over the cave entrance without quite reaching her. Bruno was a good listener. He didn't offer opinions, which she appreciated because opinions were generally the last thing she needed and the first thing everyone tried to give her. The problem, she told him one evening in late November, is that they've already decided, so even if I succeed, they'll find a reason to explain it away. They'll say I got lucky, or that Pell helped more than he did, or that something doesn't count because of how I look. Bruno's eyebrows moved in the way of a dog following a conversation he's mostly following. But I know, she said. That's the thing. Even if nobody else ever knows, I will know exactly what I did and how I did it, and nobody can take that. She said it firmly, and she meant it, and she also thought, but it would be really nice if someone else knew too. She allowed herself that small dishonesty. She was not going to pretend she was entirely above wanting recognition. She just wasn't willing to stop working because she lacked it. The first contact she had with actual social pressure came in the form of Reverend Hatch's wife, Dolores, who appeared at the base of the Ridge Road one Thursday morning in mid-November, carrying a basket and an expression that tried to look like kindness and landed closer to pity. She was a thin woman, energetic in the way of people who channel their anxiety into movement, and she had been the informal information broker of Harrow's Creek for at least 20 years. Maribel saw her coming from the cave entrance while she was doing the morning pen check and felt the specific tired feeling that came with having to manage someone else's perception of you before you'd even finished your first cup of morning tea. She walked down to meet Dolores at the bottom of the path rather than invite her up, which was a small strategic choice that she was not entirely proud of but made anyway. Maribel. Dolores held out the basket. I brought preserves and some flour. The women's circle took up a small collection. That's very kind, Maribel said, which was true. She took the basket. Please thank everyone. Dolores looked past her toward the cave entrance. Her expression was doing several things at once. Is it livable? Up there? Yes. Because there's a woman in town, a widow herself, who takes in boarders. It's not expensive and I have my own home, Maribel said, but I appreciate you coming all the way out. Dolores looked at her. There was a silence that had the specific texture of a woman trying to decide how hard to push something. People worry, she said finally. A woman alone. That cave. People say it's dangerous, that there are animals. There are. I've seen tracks. Bear and mountain lion both, old ones, from before I arrived. Nothing recent. This was accurate. She had found old tracks and scat near the ridge's upper section, but nothing that suggested current regular habitation. The sheep are fenced and the pen is covered on the north side. If something comes, Bruno will let me know. Dolores looked at Bruno, who sat at Maribel's heel, and looked back at Dolores with the calm, slightly judging expression he turned on most people he hadn't decided to like yet. Well, Dolores said, you seem like you know what you're doing. The surprise in her voice was not subtle, but Maribel chose not to address it. I do, she said. Thank you for the provisions. After Dolores left, making her way back down the ridge road with the particular careful stepping of a woman not used to uneven ground, Maribel opened the basket and found 2 jars of preserves, a sack of flour, a small wrapped piece of hard cheese, and at the very bottom, tucked under a cloth, a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. Silas Whitmore asked Pastor Hatch last Sunday whether you'd come back to town yet. He seemed certain you would. I thought you should know. D.H. Maribel read this twice. Then she folded it back up and put it in her coat pocket and went back up to the pen to check on Stubborn, who had been looking at her this morning with the expression of a sheep that was considering doing something inadvisable. Silas Whitmore was waiting for her to fail. Of course he was. He had thrown her out of that house with the calm certainty of a man who already knew the ending of the story, who had written the ending himself in his own head and was now simply waiting for events to confirm his authorship. She scratched Stubborn between the ears, which the sheep tolerated for approximately 4 seconds before moving away. "Not yet," Maribel said, to the sheep or to Silas Whitmore, or to the cold air or to nobody in particular. "He's going to be waiting a long time." December came hard. Not the killing cold that would define January and February in this part of the territory, but hard enough. Night temperatures that dropped well below freezing, morning frost that turned the rocks outside the cave entrance into something approaching glass, and a thin, persistent wind that found every gap she'd missed in the pen's north wall and reminded her about it. She found 2 of those gaps in the first week of December and packed them with moss and shaped clay, but the clay froze and cracked in a new way in freezing temperatures, and she spent a frustrated afternoon figuring out that she needed to mix animal fat into the clay to give it some flexibility when it hardened in the cold. She got the fat from Pell, who had a barrel of old tallow he sold for lamp fuel, and the clay-tallow mixture held better, and she cataloged this in her memory as the kind of knowledge that nobody would ever think to teach you, and that you could only learn by doing the wrong thing first. The ewes grew their winter coats, which was expected, and they also grew calmer and more comfortable with her, which was less expected and more gratifying. Stubborn in particular had developed a habit of following Maribel around the pen when she did her morning checks, not because she wanted attention, she generally rejected it after 4 seconds, but because she seemed to prefer being near Maribel to being near the other 2. Maribel could not explain this and chose not to try. She had also, by early December, made a decision about the flock that was either smart or foolish, and she wasn't entirely sure which. Pell had told her about a man named Odell who lived about 12 miles out on the North Road, and who had a ram he sometimes hired out for a fee. The fee was not small. She did not have it, but she had calculated carefully in the back of her cabin by lantern light with a stubby pencil on a piece of brown wrapping paper that if she could get Stubborn and the other 2 ewes pregnant before the deep winter set in, she would have lambs in the spring. Lambs in the spring meant a growing flock. A growing flock meant wool in the summer. Wool in the summer meant money, actual money, enough to make Pell's credit ledger show something other than debt. The problem was the fee. She went to Pell. "I can't pay Odell's fee right now," she said, not preambling it. Pell was behind his counter inventorying something in a wooden crate. He didn't look up. "I know. But I could trade labor. Odell's wife, does he still have that wife who makes the quilts?" Now Pell looked up. "Marjorie Odell, yes. Does she sell them or just make them for family?" "She sells when she can get a buyer. It's hard to get buyers this far from town." "I can move quilts through you," Maribel said. "If I can get to Odell, convince him to let his ram work my 3 ewes against Marjorie's quilts coming through your shop, and you take a cut of each quilt sold, and I handle the transport." Pell put down whatever he was counting. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first day she'd come in asking about land, with that ambiguous expression that might be respect or might be something else. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "About a week," she said. "It might work." "I know. Will you talk to Odell?" "You should talk to Odell. I'll write you a letter of introduction if it helps." "It would help," she said. "Thank you." She went to Odell the following Saturday, driving Pell's cart on a road that was frozen hard enough to rattle her teeth the whole 12 miles. Odell was a big man, skeptical by default, with a handshake that was harder than necessary and a way of looking at people from the top down that reminded her of Silas, though Odell had none of Silas's particular cruelty. His skepticism was more general, equal opportunity, extended to everyone until they gave him a reason to revise it. He read Pell's letter. He looked at Maribel. He said, "You really living in that cave on the ridge?" "I built a cabin inside it," she said. "A cabin inside a cave. The cave stays warmer than outside in winter. The rock holds the temperature, and the spring is reliable. It's actually better situated than most surface homesteads in this weather." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Marjorie." Marjorie Odell came out from the back room. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had the look of someone who made her assessments quickly and trusted them. She listened to what Maribel said about moving quilts through Pell's shop, asked 2 questions about how the transportation would work, and then looked at her husband. "Bring the ram," she said. That was all. Odell brought the ram the following week, stayed long enough to ensure the situation was proceeding correctly in the biological sense, and left without much further conversation. The ram was a good-tempered animal, which surprised Maribel, who had expected something more difficult. He went with the ewes into the pen and treated the whole arrangement with a cooperative spirit that was almost refreshing. Maribel checked her brown wrapping paper calculations again that night. If everything went right, if all 3 ewes caught and carried through, if the lambs came healthy in spring, if she could get the first wool clip sheared and sold by midsummer, she would have something, not wealth, not comfort, not the life Thomas had promised her before he got sick and stopped being able to deliver on promises. But something, a margin between her and disaster that hadn't existed before. Everything going right was, of course, not guaranteed. What she did not anticipate was Clarence Mall. Clarence Mall was 24 years old and worked part-time for Silas Whitmore moving cattle and part-time for whichever other ranch needed a hand, and he had apparently decided somewhere along the line that Maribel Rowan's cave property would be a good place to camp during a long ride between jobs. She came back from Pell's one afternoon in mid-December to find a horse tethered below the ridge and a fire laid just outside her cave entrance. Not inside. The fire was outside, and Clarence himself was sitting on one of her rock windbreak stones, eating something from a saddlebag and looking entirely comfortable. She brought the cart to a stop at the base of the path. He looked up. "Oh, hey." He did not stand. "Didn't think anybody was around." "This is my land," Maribel said. "Sure, I'm not bothering anything." He nodded toward the cave. "Didn't go in, just needed somewhere to rest the horse." "There's a way station 8 miles west on the county road. That's 8 miles. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a young man deciding whether to be annoyed at a woman who was being inconvenient. She recognized the calculation in his face. She was one woman, alone, and he was a young man who worked for Silas Whitmore, and in his mental ledger those 2 facts should have arranged themselves into a particular kind of social order. "Is this really your land?" he said. "Because I heard Silas." "The deed is in my cabin," she said. "Do you want to see it?" He looked at her again. Then he looked at Bruno, who had climbed down from the cart and was sitting at the base of the path looking up at Clarence Mall with the focused, level attention of a dog that has made a decision about someone. "Fine," Clarence said. He stood, kicked out his fire, and untethered his horse. He didn't look at Maribel again as he rode past her. He did give Bruno a wide berth. She watched him go. Then she went up and checked the pen and the cabin and walked the whole perimeter of her property in the last thin light of the December afternoon, not because she thought Clarence had taken anything. She didn't think that. But because it was her land and she needed to know that it was still as she'd left it. Everything was where she'd put it. Bruno walked beside her on the perimeter, nose down, cataloging what the horse had left behind in terms of scent. He did not seem alarmed. He was the kind of dog who understood the difference between a genuine threat and an inconvenience, and had apparently classified Clarence Mall as the latter. "Good call," she told him. What the Clarence Mall incident told her, more than anything practical, was that her isolation was not going to be permanent. Word was getting around about where she lived and what she was doing, and some of that word was neutral or curious, like Dolores Hatch with her basket, and some of it would be something else. She needed to make the property clearly, visibly hers in ways that went beyond a deed in a cabin. She needed markers. She needed a presence that the land announced even when she wasn't standing on it. She started on the gate the next day. It was not an elaborate gate. She had limited materials and limited time, and she was more interested in function than appearance. But she built a proper gate across the path at the base of the ridge. Hung on 2 posts, she sank 18 inches into the frozen ground, using the pry bar, and a method that took her 2 days to work out and involved heating the iron spike in the stove first, and driving it down to thaw the ground enough to dig. The gate swung and latched, and she carved her name into the crossbeam, Rowan, with the chisel she borrowed from Pell, and returned the following Saturday. She also built a second sign and planted it at the base of the ridge road where it met the main track, a simple board on a post that said, Raven Bluff, M. Rowan, Private. She stood at the bottom of the ridge road and looked at that sign and felt, for the first time since she'd driven away from the Whitmore house with her wet coat and Thomas's mud-spattered letters, that she was standing on her own ground in every sense of the phrase. The second week of December brought the first serious cold. Not the worst cold, that was still weeks away, but serious enough that the water in the trough developed a skin of ice overnight that she had to break each morning with the flat of her pry bar. She had anticipated this and built a simple brush pile cover for the trough that slowed the freezing, but the brush cover was imperfect, and the ice came back anyway, and she broke it every morning and thought about what she might do better next year. Next year. She caught herself thinking in those terms and felt the weight of it, the assumption embedded in that phrase that she would still be here next year. 6 weeks ago, she hadn't been sure she'd still be here next week. She allowed herself a small private satisfaction about that, the satisfaction of finding, in the middle of something very hard, that you have stopped thinking about how long you can survive and started thinking about what you'll do when you're still here. She also started sleeping better. This surprised her more than it should have. The physical exhaustion helped. She was working harder than she had in her entire life, and her body made its requirements clear every night by shutting her down whether she was ready or not. But it was more than exhaustion. She had begun to belong to the cave, or the cave had begun to belong to her, the relationship between a person and a place they've made their own. And her nervous system had registered this fact even before her conscious mind fully had. She stopped waking in the night convinced she'd heard something wrong. She stopped lying in the dark running catastrophic calculations. She slept, and she woke, and she did her work, and it was enough. Pell came to see the homestead in the third week of December. She hadn't invited him and wasn't expecting him, but she heard the cart on the frozen road before she saw it and walked down to the gate to meet him. He drove through when she opened it, and she brought him up the path, and she watched his face as he took in the windbreak, the pen, the gate, the sign she'd carved, the entrance to the cave. He was quiet for a long time. "You built all this," he said. "Most of it. You provided the timber. I provided lumber. I didn't provide the knowing how." He walked toward the pen and looked over the rail at the 3 ewes, who looked back at him with the profound disinterest of animals, who have been visited by enough humans to stop finding it notable. "They're looking well." "They should be pregnant," Maribel said. "We'll know in a few weeks if it took." He nodded. He walked to the cave entrance and looked in. "Can I?" he said. She led him through the entrance, past the windbreak, back to the cabin. She pushed open the door. He looked in at the stove, the pallet on its raised frame, the shelf she'd built along the back wall, the row of supplies she'd organized with the particular precision of someone who knows that disorganization in a small space costs you time you don't have. He stood there for a minute without saying anything. She waited, because she had learned that Pell's silences were usually doing something. "Silas Whitmore asked me last week if you'd sold the land yet," he said finally. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I hadn't heard anything about it." "That's true." "He said to let him know." Pell looked at her carefully. "He didn't ask how you were doing. He asked about the land." Maribel thought about this. What does he want it for? "I don't know. Could be nothing. Could be he's heard something about it I haven't." "There's nothing to hear. It's a cave on a rocky hillside. With a spring. With a small spring." "Springs are water rights," Pell said. "Water rights are worth money out here. You know that." She did know that. She'd known it when Pell first mentioned the spring 6 weeks ago, and it had been part of her calculation, one of the things that made the $20 make sense. She just hadn't thought about it from Silas's angle before. Hadn't thought that the man who'd thrown her out might, eventually, look at what he'd thrown her toward and decide he wanted that too. "He can't buy it," she said. "It's mine. I have the deed." "People find ways around deeds," Pell said, not unkindly. "What kind of ways?" "Pressure. Lowball offers. Having somebody question the sale in court, making it not worth the trouble to hold on to." He paused. "I'm not saying that's what he's planning. I'm saying he's the kind of man who plans." Maribel stood in the cold cave entrance and thought about Silas Whitmore's smile the morning he'd thrown her coat into the mud. The size of it, the satisfaction in it, the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about the things he was certain about. "Then I need to be the kind of woman who plans better," she said. She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact about the weather. But she felt the truth of it settle into her like the cold settled into the rock, deep and permanent, and not going anywhere. Pell looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I think you already are. He drove back down the ridge road as the afternoon light thinned toward evening. Maribel stood at the gate and watched him go, and then stood there a while longer, looking out across the valley toward Harrow's Creek, which was invisible from here, but present the way all familiar things are present even when you can't see them. The winter was not finished with her. She knew that. The worst of it was still ahead. The weeks in January when the temperature wouldn't climb above freezing even at noon, when the ridge would be locked in a cold that came down out of the north like something with a purpose. She had prepared for it as well as she could. She had firewood stacked deep in the cave against the east wall. She had her tallow stores and her food laid in, and her water system tested and her pen reinforced on every side. She had 3 ewes who were probably pregnant, and a dog who had decided she was worth staying with, and a cabin built inside a cave on a piece of land that cost $20, and that a powerful man in town had started to think about in a way that suggested he'd noticed it was worth more than that. She went back inside. She stoked the stove and sat on the edge of her pallet and took out the brown wrapping paper with her calculations on it and looked at them in the lamplight. She had a pencil stub, and she did something she hadn't let herself do yet. She projected the column forward, past spring, past the first wool clip, past summer, into the following winter. What a second year could look like. What a second year with a larger flock and an established water system and a reinforced pen and a reputation, even a bad one, even a mocking one, for having survived where experienced men had not. Bruno put his chin on her knee and looked at the paper. "I know you can't read," she said. He continued looking at the paper. "It's a plan," she said. "It might work." She put the pencil down and lay back and pulled the blanket up and listened to the fire in the stove and the quiet breath of the cave around her and the distant settling sounds of the sheep in their pen, and she thought about what Pell had said. He asked about the land. In the cave, in the dark, with the warmth of the stove pressing against the cold outside, Maribel Rowan smiled. And it was not the wide, satisfied smile of a man who had just thrown a coat into the mud. It was smaller than that, and it meant something completely different. The January cold arrived without warning, the way the worst things always do. Not a gradual deepening of the chill she'd been managing since December, but a hard turn. One night she went to sleep with temperatures that were merely punishing and woke at 3 in the morning to a cold so complete and absolute that the air inside the cabin felt different, thicker somehow, like the cold had mass and weight and was pressing itself against every surface. The stove had burned low. She got up in the dark and fed it without fully waking, by touch and habit, and lay back down and pulled the blanket up to her chin and listened. The wind was doing something she hadn't heard before. It wasn't the usual ridge wind, the northwest sweep that came down in gusts and rattled the cave entrance brush. This was lower in pitch and steadier, more like a sustained pressure than a movement, and it carried inside it a sound she couldn't immediately name, a kind of subtone that she felt in her chest more than she heard with her ears. Bruno was awake. She could tell by his breathing, which had changed from the slow rhythm of sleep to something more alert. He wasn't growling, he was just listening, the same as she was. She got up and put on her coat and boots and took the lantern to the cave entrance. What she saw stopped her where she stood. The valley below the ridge was gone. Not dark. Gone. Replaced by a white that moved and shifted and had no bottom to it that she could see. The blizzard had come in from the northwest while she slept and had swallowed the landscape the way a river swallows a stone, completely, without acknowledgement. The ridge itself was visible only in outline, the dark rock showing through the white in patches, and even those patches were disappearing as she watched. The temperature at the cave entrance was enough to make her eyes water in the first 10 seconds. She went back to the stove and stoked it fully, and sat down and started to think. She had prepared for a hard winter. She had laid in wood and food and tallow, and she had reinforced the pen on 3 sides, and she had the water system running inside the cave. What she had not fully prepared for was a blizzard of this specific character, not just cold, but the kind of sustained driving cold that could kill livestock in their enclosures, that could take a well-built pen and turn it into a death trap if the wind found the right angle and pushed the temperature inside the shelter below what the animals could survive. She did the calculations in her head and didn't like the answer. The ewes were in the pen, which was built against the cave's eastern exterior wall and had a solid roof. She'd added that roof in November after a wet October had convinced her that open-air shelter was a liability. The roof was good. The walls on 3 sides were good. The fourth side, the south-facing opening, had a canvas flap that she'd secured against the frame, but that was designed for rain and normal cold, not for a blizzard that was already, at 4 in the morning, showing signs of intending to last. She went out to the pen. The ewes were bunched together in the back corner, which was what sheep do when they're cold and frightened. They press together and share heat, which is one of the smarter things about them. Stubborn was in the middle of the group, which was also smart of her in a strictly self-interested way. The canvas flap was holding, but it was pulling hard against its lashings with every gust, and she could see daylight, or rather blue-white blizzard light, coming through the gap at the lower left corner where the wind had found purchase. She lashed it tighter. Then she went back inside and got the spare canvas she'd been using as a secondary ground cover inside the cabin, and brought it out and doubled the flap, overlapping the edges and tying them with everything she had that was rope-like and available. It took 20 minutes in the dark with hands that stopped working properly around the 5-minute mark, and she did it by will more than dexterity, her fingers finding the knots by feel because she couldn't feel anything below her wrist by the time she was halfway through. Back inside the cabin. Hands over the stove. Bruno pressing against her legs. The wind found a new pitch somewhere around 5 in the morning. A higher, narrower sound, almost a whistle, that meant it was moving fast enough through the cave entrance gap to create a tone. She had not thought about the cave entrance gap in terms of the blizzard because the cave entrance faced east and the blizzard was coming from the northwest, and she'd assumed the ridge itself would provide shelter. This assumption was partly right, but the ridge was creating an eddy. She could feel it in the way the entrance air moved, not a direct blast, but a swirling secondary current that found the gap and pushed through it steadily, cold and constant. She spent an hour that morning filling the entrance gap with everything she could improvise. More moss, more clay tallow mix, a folded piece of canvas wedged into the space with the handle of her pry bar. The gap was not large, maybe 3 inches at its widest, but 3 inches of blizzard-cold air moving continuously into a small enclosed space is not a small thing, and she worked on it until she could put her palm against the fill and feel only the faintest seep. By mid-morning, she had achieved a version of sealed, which was not the same as actually sealed, but was close enough to matter. The cabin temperature stabilized. The stove was running hot. She was burning through wood faster than she'd planned, which was a problem for later, not now. And the air inside the cabin was warm enough that she could take off her outer coat. She ate. She made herself eat properly, not just quick handfuls of dried meat, but a real portion of porridge with a scrape of the hard cheese Dolores Hatch had put in the basket 2 months ago, which had kept well in the cave's cool, consistent temperature. She needed fuel. Her body was doing enormous amounts of work even when she was sitting still, maintaining temperature in an environment that wanted to drain it. And if she let herself get depleted, she'd make bad decisions. And bad decisions in a blizzard of this scale had a cost she wasn't in a position to pay. After she ate, she went to check on the ewes again. The doubled canvas was holding. The ewes were still bunched in the corner, but they'd settled. No longer actively alarmed, just managing, which was what she wanted. She checked their water trough. The ice was back, a thin skim, and she broke it with the pry bar. She gave them extra feed from the sack she'd brought in from the cave store 2 weeks ago when she'd first started seeing the weather signs. The feed was limited. She had enough for 3 weeks if she was careful. 4 if she reduced portions, but reducing portions in hard weather was a calculation she didn't want to make unless she had to. She went back inside. This pattern, check the pen, come back inside, stoke the stove, eat a little, check the pen again, became her entire existence for the next 4 days. The blizzard did not behave as she had hoped. She'd expected it to peak in the first day and begin easing by the second, which was how most big storms in this region worked. This one did not. It held its intensity into the second day and through the night and into the third morning with a stubbornness that reminded her of something she couldn't immediately place, and then she realized she was comparing it to herself. And she thought, well, fair. On the third day, a post in the pen's western wall cracked. She heard it from inside the cabin, a sharp sound like a rifle shot, loud enough to bring her up off the pallet before she was fully awake. She was in her coat and boots and out the cabin door in under a minute, lantern in hand, and she found the western post split longitudinally, still standing but compromised, the wall it supported leaning inward by about 15 degrees. The cold had gotten into a crack she hadn't known was there and expanded it until the wood gave. The ewes had moved away from that wall and were pressing against the east side, wide-eyed and tightly grouped, and Stubborn was making the sound she made when she was genuinely frightened, a short repeated bleat that had a different texture than her usual complaining. Maribel stood in the blizzard outside the pen for probably 10 seconds, assessing, while the cold hit her face hard enough to make her eyes fill with water that froze on her lashes. She needed to brace the post. She needed to do it fast, in the dark, in a blizzard, with hands that were already losing sensation. She needed something to brace it with that she had, and that would hold. She went back into the cave and looked at what she had. The spare timber from the cabin construction was stacked along the east cave wall. There were 4 pieces left, not long, about 5 feet each, the offcuts from when she'd sized the roof beams. She grabbed 2 of them and the hammer and a handful of nails and went back out. She worked by lantern light and touch. She drove the first brace into the ground at an angle against the cracked post, not straight down, which would have required a longer piece, but angled, using the triangular geometry her father had taught her, the principle that a diagonal member takes compression from 2 directions. She drove the nail through the brace into the post with hands she could barely feel, and each hammer swing was more a determined fall of weight than a controlled strike, and 2 of the nails bent and had to be pulled and reset, and the 3rd one went in at an angle that wasn't ideal but held, and the 4th one went in clean. She did the 2nd brace beside the 1st. Then she stood back, in the dark and the blizzard, and pushed against the western wall with both hands, hard. It didn't move. She went back inside and stood over the stove for 10 minutes before she could feel her fingers again. Bruno had not gone back to sleep. He was sitting up on the pallet, watching her with an expression that communicated, with great dog economy, something between, "Are you all right? And please stay inside now." "I'm all right," she said. He did not look entirely convinced. On the 4th day, the blizzard changed. It didn't stop. It was not the kind of storm that stopped cleanly, but it shifted, the way storms shift when they're beginning to exhaust themselves, the wind dropping from its sustained pressure to something more intermittent, gusts with gaps between them instead of one unbroken push. The temperature didn't rise. If anything, it dropped in the gust gaps, the specific deep cold that comes when the wind is no longer doing the work of carrying temperature, but the temperature has set itself into the ground and the air like something that lives there now. She was awake when the shift happened, around 2 in the morning of the 4th night, and she lay in the dark and listened to it and felt something unknot in her chest that had been knitted tight since the first morning. She allowed herself this. She pressed her face into Bruno's neck and held on for about a minute, and she did not cry, but she was close to it. Not from sadness, but from the specific accumulated weight of 4 days of sustained crisis management, the kind of weight that only shows itself once the crisis has eased enough that you can feel it. "Okay," she said into his fur. "Okay." He made a small sound and didn't move, which was the right response. She slept properly for the first time in 4 days. She woke to silence. Not the silence of the cave which she'd grown used to, the contained mineral quiet of stone and still air. The silence outside had a different quality, the absence of wind silence that means a storm has passed, and through the cave entrance she could see, for the first time in 4 days, actual light. Not the blue-white moving light of the blizzard, but static, pale winter sunlight hitting the white of the new snow and sending it back into the cave entrance at an angle that lit the cave walls in a way she hadn't seen before, turning the gray stone a pale, unlikely gold. She went outside. The valley was transformed. The word she thought of standing at the cave entrance was buried. Everything was buried. The fence lines, the distant road, the tracks she'd worn between the cave and the pen. The snow was waist-deep at the base of the ridge, chest-deep in the places where the wind had pushed it against the rock faces. It was also, in the morning light, extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary you can feel even when you're tired and your hands hurt and you have 3 possibly pregnant ewes to check on and a cracked post to properly repair and a wood supply that has been depleted further than you wanted. She let herself look at it for 30 seconds. Then she went to check on the ewes, all 3 alive, all 3 standing. Stubborn walked to the pen rail when Maribel appeared and pressed her nose against it with the particular insistence of an animal who has opinions about how long the service gap has been and intends to communicate them. "I know," Maribel said. "I'm sorry." She fed them and broke the ice in the trough and checked the braced post, which had held perfectly, and the doubled canvas flap, which had also held though it had taken a beating, the outer canvas torn along one edge from wind stress. She made a note to replace it as soon as she had material. She was walking back toward the cave entrance when Bruno stopped. I was about 15 feet ahead of her, near the east side of the cave entrance, and he stopped with the completeness that animals use when they're not going any further and the message they're sending is serious. His nose was up, his ears were forward. Every part of him that could be pointed at something was pointed at a specific place. Not the cave entrance exactly, but the deep shadowed area to the right of it, where the ridge overhang created a recess about 8 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Maribel stopped. She looked at the recess. It looked back. The mountain lion was large. She couldn't tell exactly how large because it was compressed into the back of the recess, a posture that cats use when they're uncertain rather than when they're preparing to attack. But the head alone was as broad as both her hands side by side, and the eyes, catching what little light reached the recess, were a color she didn't have an exact word for. Amber was too warm, gold was too bright, something between the two, and very still. She understood, in the way that you understand things in the moment before your brain has finished processing them, several facts simultaneously. The lion had sheltered in the recess during the blizzard, which meant it had been there for up to 4 days. It had not entered the cave, which meant it had either not known about the cave or had chosen not to enter it, possibly because of human scent. It was hungry, certainly, 4 days in a blizzard with nothing to hunt. And the smell of the ewes was directly behind her, and Bruno, who was a good and brave dog, was going to do something inadvisable if she didn't manage this in the next 30 seconds. "Bruno," she said very quietly. "Stay." He stayed. He did not look happy about it. She thought about the rifle she did not have. She had intended to get a rifle and had not yet been able to afford one, and she had filed this under future problems, and this was the future. She had the pry bar, which was leaning against the pen wall about 20 feet away, and which she was not going to reach before the lion made a decision about what was happening. What she had was the cave. She had spent months understanding the cave, its dimensions, its angles, the way it moved air, the way it moved sound. She knew that the cave's acoustics were unusual, a product of its depth and the shape of its interior, the way the back wall curved slightly and the ceiling height changed. She had discovered this by accident in October when she'd knocked over the iron spike near the back, and the clang of it had bounced off the back wall and come back to her from 3 different angles at once, louder than it had any right to be. She'd spent an evening testing it afterward, curious, the way she was curious about anything that behaved differently than she expected. She knew what the cave could do with sound. She backed up 4 steps, slowly, keeping herself between the lion and the pen, keeping her eyes on the amber gold eyes in the recess. Then she turned and walked into the cave. She went to the back, all the way back to the place where the ceiling dropped and the spring came up from the floor and the curved back wall created its acoustic peculiarity. She picked up the iron spike from where it lived against the east wall. She picked up the hammer from where she'd left it after the post repair. She hit the spike against the cave wall as hard as she could, twice, fast. The sound that came back was not the sound of a hammer hitting a spike. That sound, the original, the source, was a sharp metallic ring, not particularly impressive. What came back from the cave was something else, a layered, multiplied, omnidirectional resonance that filled the cave from floor to ceiling and came from apparently everywhere at once. A sound that had no clear origin and therefore no clear limit. It sounded large. It sounded like something that lived in the rock and had been disturbed. She did it again, 3 times. Then she did something her mother used to do when she was trying to move stubborn cattle. She shouted, low and from the chest, a sustained vowel sound that wasn't a word, just volume and duration, and the cave took it and turned it into something that had no human scale to it, something that bounced off the curved back wall and the angled ceiling and the floor and came at the entrance from every direction at once. She heard it herself, and it startled her, and she was the one making it. She heard Bruno outside barking now, a big territorial bark that she'd only heard from him twice before, both times at strangers she'd later decided he was right to be wary of. She hit the spike 3 more times. Then she waited. Silence. She walked to the cave entrance slowly, looked toward the recess. Empty. She could see the lion's tracks in the snow, the compressed ovals of paws moving fast, northeast, up over the ridge. They were deep and purposeful, and there was no hesitation in them, no circling. The lion had made a decision and carried it out thoroughly. Bruno was standing at the edge of the pen's south side, hackles still raised, nose tracking the direction of the tracks. He looked at Maribel when she appeared. Something in his posture asked a question. "It's gone," she said. He took another 4 seconds to confirm this to his own satisfaction. Then his hackles dropped, and he sneezed, the full-body sneeze of a dog releasing tension, and walked over to her and leaned his weight against her leg. She put her hand on his head. Her own heart was doing something considerable in her chest, a delayed reaction that she'd been keeping tamped down for the last several minutes, and that now came up without her permission, and she stood with her hand on Bruno's head and breathed through it the way her mother had taught her to breathe through frightening things. Slowly, through the nose, until the body stopped being quite so certain that the emergency was still happening. It took a while. The lion did not come back. She checked for tracks every morning for the next week and found none. The recess remained empty. Whatever she'd done to that lion's sense of what Raven Bluff was, whatever impression the cave's amplified voice had left in an animal that operated by instinct and memory, it had been sufficient. She told Pell about it the next Saturday when she drove into town for supplies. He listened without interrupting, which was his habit. When she finished, he said, "You're lucky it didn't charge." "I know," she said. "Mountain lion in a blizzard, 4 days without food, smelling sheep. That's about as bad a combination as you can have." "I know that too." "But it didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "The cave echoes," he said, as if working through the physics of it. "Dramatically. I'd tested it in October. I knew what it would do." He looked at her for a long, considering moment. "You tested the cave's echo in October." "I knocked something over accidentally and noticed it. Then I tested it on purpose because I thought it might be useful." Pell shook his head once, slowly, which she'd learned meant he was recalibrating something. "I'll tell you what," he said. "Silas Whitmore had a man go check on the north pasture yesterday. Lost 11 head. Froze, some of them, and the shelter he'd built came down under the snow weight. 11 head. She thought about what 11 head represented. The cost. The loss. The spring without those animals. The summer without their wool or their calves. She thought about her 3 ewes, all alive, all standing, stubborn already back to pressing her nose against the rail with her usual entitled energy. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and she meant it in the way you mean something that is genuinely bad news, even when there is another feeling running alongside it that you don't entirely want to acknowledge. "He's not the only one," Pell said. "Garrity lost 6. The Denton brothers lost their whole chicken flock and 2 pigs. County road still impassable past the 3rd mile marker. Stage isn't running." The storm had been bigger than she'd understood from inside the cave. She'd known it was serious. She'd been living in the middle of it for 4 days, but she hadn't had a way to measure it against the wider world while it was happening. "How bad is it?" she said. "Across the territory." "Bad," he said simply. She drove back to Raven Bluff thinking about this. Not about Silas. She'd get to Silas eventually, she knew that, but about the territory. About what a winter like this did to a community that depended on livestock for its economic survival. The animals that died this winter wouldn't be replaced easily. The ranches that lost significant portions of their flocks and herds would be operating at reduced capacity through spring and into summer. Feed would be expensive. Lambs and calves that would normally be available for purchase in spring would be fewer. She thought about her 3 ewes, who were probably pregnant. She thought about the lambs those ewes might produce. She thought about what it would mean to have healthy lambs to sell in a spring where healthy lambs were scarce. She didn't let herself get too far ahead of it. Pregnancy wasn't confirmed, and even if it was, lambs didn't arrive without risk, and she'd never assisted a sheep birth before and would have to manage it herself. There were 100 ways the calculation could fall apart before it delivered on its premise. But she thought about it. In late January, Pell brought her something she hadn't asked for. He drove up the Ridge Road on a Tuesday afternoon, a rare midweek visit, and climbed down from the cart with his usual deliberate economy of movement and said, without preamble, "There's a letter for you at the post office from a solicitor in Renwick County." She looked at him. "What kind of solicitor?" "The kind that represents men who want to buy things from people who don't want to sell them." She felt the cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Silas." The letter's politely worded, It says that a buyer has expressed interest in your property and that you may find the offered price agreeable and that the buyer is prepared to close quickly. Pell paused. I read it twice because I thought I might have missed something. I didn't miss anything. That's all it says. What's the price? $40? $40 for a piece of land she'd bought for 20, with a spring and a cave and 3 months of her own labor built into it, and 3 probably pregnant ewes living on it, and a gate with her name on it, and a cabin she'd built with her own hands inside a mountain. No, she said. I told the post clerk you'd be in to reply yourself. I will. She looked at him. Pell, when Silas comes in, and he will come in, he'll want to know my answer in person. He's that kind of man. What will you tell him? That I don't carry messages for Silas Whitmore. She nodded. Good. She went to the post office the following Saturday and wrote her reply at the clerk's counter, in the tidy, legible hand her mother had drilled into her through a childhood of practice. Thank you for your inquiry. Raven Bluff is not for sale at any price. M. Rowan. She gave it to the clerk, who looked at it and then looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that he was watching something that would be talked about later. She drove back to the ridge. The weather in late January softened incrementally, the way winter softens in this part of the territory. Not a thaw, not warmth, but a slight relaxation of the killing cold into merely serious cold, a distinction that felt enormous after the blizzard and the weeks that followed it. She was able to get outside for longer periods. She started the repairs she'd been cataloging in her head throughout the worst of it. The torn canvas on the pen flap, the post she needed to properly replace rather than just brace, the section of the windbreak at the cave entrance that had shifted under the snow weight. The post replacement was the most difficult. The ground was still frozen solid, and she had to use the heated spike method to thaw it, working in short sessions to keep from getting too cold, over the better part of 3 days. She pulled the cracked post, sank a new one, the last of the timber she had, and packed the hole with a mixture of rocks and frozen soil that she knew would need to be retamped in spring when the ground softened and settled. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was good enough for the remainder of winter. The first sign she had that the ewes were pregnant came in early February, when she noticed that Stubborn's belly, which had always had a certain comfortable amplitude to it, had changed in character, become lower and more pronounced, a change in shape rather than just size. Maribel stood at the pen rail and looked at her for a long time, counting weeks backward in her head. If her count was right, she was looking at late March, possibly early April. She had 7 weeks, maybe 8. She went back to Pell on the matter of sheep birth because Pell had been here longer than almost anyone, and knew things about the practical management of frontier life that she couldn't get from any other source she had access to. She asked him directly, "What do you know about sheep birth, and what do I need to know that I don't know to do it alone?" He told her. He told her for about an hour, in the back of the trading post with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, covering the normal cases and the abnormal ones, the signs that things were going well and the signs that they weren't, what you could do alone and what required more than one set of hands. He also told her about a woman on the county's South Road, a widow herself, named June Curran, who had run sheep for 15 years before her husband died, and who had been the person everyone in the territory called when an animal birth went wrong. "She'd help you?" Maribel asked. "I think she'd respect the question," Pell said. "June Curran respects people who know what they don't know." Maribel drove south the following week and found June Curran's place without too much difficulty. It was described in Pell's directions as the property with the blue-painted fence posts, which she'd thought was a strange identifier until she saw the fence posts, which were in fact a very particular shade of blue that she later learned June Curran had mixed herself from copper mineral and white lime because she'd read somewhere that blue kept flies off fencing and had decided to test it. June Curran was 61 years old, with a face that had been in the frontier sun for 40 of those years, and showed every one of them, and hands that moved with the automatic competence of someone who has done difficult physical work for so long that the work and the person have become the same thing. She listened to Maribel explain who she was, and where she lived, and what her situation was, and she asked 3 questions: how far along, how many, and had Maribel ever assisted any animal birth. Late March to early April, 3 ewes. And no, Maribel said. June Curran looked at her the way people in this territory looked at you when they were deciding something important. "You're the woman in the cave." "That's right." I heard about the blizzard. I heard your sheep all came through. They did. June was quiet for a moment. I'll come when you send for me. Send Bruno ahead if you need me in the night. I know that dog by sight. Pels mentioned him. I'll understand the message. I don't want to take advantage of your time. You're not. I've been too long on this property by myself. She said it simply, without self-pity. It'll do me good to be needed somewhere. Maribel drove back to the ridge in the late afternoon light, the cold pressing in from the northwest again, but not the killing cold. Just the ordinary February cold, the familiar cold, the cold she'd learned to move through. February moved slowly, and then suddenly, the way months do when you're waiting for something. The days lengthened incrementally, enough to notice, but not enough to feel warm. The snow on the valley floor began to compact and settle, losing its height while keeping its presence. And on the south-facing rock faces of the ridge she could see, in the afternoon sun, the first tentative seep of melt that wasn't melt exactly, but the beginning of the long process that would eventually become spring. She spent those weeks finishing everything she could finish that didn't require spring conditions, reinforcing, organizing, building up her firewood stores against another possible cold snap, making careful notes on the brown wrapping paper about what she had and what she'd need for the lambing season. She added a second page to the brown wrapping paper for the first time. The numbers on it were still modest, still fragile, still dependent on things going right. But they were larger than the numbers had been in October, and they pointed in a direction she was beginning to allow herself to believe in, and that was enough. She was at the cave entrance on a Thursday evening in late February, watching the last light come off the snow and thinking about nothing in particular when she heard the horse. Not Pell's cart. She knew the sound of that, the specific rhythm of his old roan on the ridge road. This was a different horse, moving at a deliberate walk, and it was coming from the direction of town, and it arrived at her gate a few minutes later carrying a man she hadn't expected to see. Clarence Mull. He stopped at the gate and took off his hat in a gesture that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. He looked different than he had in December. Less casual, less certain of his natural rights, as if the winter had knocked something out of him that hadn't quite come back. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. She stood at the top of the path and looked down at him. Bruno sat at her heel and did not growl, but he watched. "Mr. Mull," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I owe you an apology for December, trespassing on your property. It was—" He stopped and started again. "It was inconsiderate, and I knew it at the time. I just—" Another stop. "I want to apologize." She looked at him. He was young. 24 was very young. She tried to remember what she'd known about the world at 24, and the answer was, enough to make mistakes confidently, not yet enough to be embarrassed by them afterward. "Apology accepted," she said. He nodded, seemed about to go, and then said, "Whitmore lost 11 head in the blizzard." "I heard," she said. "He's in a temper about the letter you sent back, about the property." Clarence looked at the gate, the sign, the path up to the cave. "He told a few of us you'd sell before spring, that you couldn't hold on." She waited. "I just thought you should know," he said, "what he's saying." She looked at this young man at her gate, turning his hat in his hands, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone is trying to pick a side and isn't sure yet which one they're picking. She thought, be careful here. Not unkind, but careful. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Now you know what he's saying isn't going to happen." Clarence looked at her for a moment, and something in his face shifted. Some small internal thing that she couldn't name but recognized as the movement a person makes when they've made a decision that isn't reversible. He put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." He turned the horse and rode back toward town. Maribel watched him go, and then she turned and looked back at her cave, at the gate with Rowan carved into the crossbeam, at the pen where her 3 ewes were moving in the early evening shadows, at the entrance to the mountain that was also her home. Silas Whitmore was in a temper and telling people she'd sell before spring. She went inside and stoked the stove and sat on the edge of her pallet and picked up the brown wrapping paper and looked at the numbers. And she felt something that she had not felt in the months since Thomas died, something that had been absent long enough that she'd almost forgotten the name for it. She felt ready, not comfortable, not confident in the easy way of people who have never had cause to doubt themselves. Ready the way the cave was ready, deep and solid and fundamentally indifferent to what the weather planned to do next, because it had been here long enough to know that the weather always passed and the rock remained. Outside, the last February light left the ridge, and the cold came back, and the cave held its temperature around her like it always had, like it would keep doing, like nobody was going to stop it from doing. Spring was coming, and Maribel Rowan was still here. March came in wet and cold and smelling of something that was almost thaw, but not quite. That particular in-between scent of ground that is thinking about releasing its frost without having fully committed to the idea. Maribel noticed it first on the south-facing rock faces of the ridge, where the afternoon sun hit longest and hardest, the ice pulling back from the stone in thin, translucent sheets that cracked and fell in the warming hours and refroze overnight and then cracked again the next afternoon. It was slow, and it was unglamorous, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months. She was also sleeping less, which was not by choice. The ewes were close. She could see it in Stubborn first. The way she stood had changed, more deliberate, more careful with her weight, and she'd started separating herself from the other two in the evenings, which was the opposite of her usual behavior. The other two, the ones Maribel had privately named Patience and Contrary, Patience because she was, and Contrary because she wasn't, had also changed in subtler ways, eating more, moving less, their wool looking denser and duller the way it did when an animal was putting its energy into something internal. She was ready, or as ready as she could be. She had driven out to June Kearns twice more in February to go over what she'd been told and ask the questions that had come up since. June had a way of teaching that was entirely without condescension. She said what she knew and then asked what Maribel understood about it, and then corrected what needed correcting and moved on, which was the most efficient teaching method Maribel had ever encountered, and which she suspected June had arrived at through decades of having no patience for wasted time. She had clean cloths set aside, and a bucket for water, and a lantern hung at the right height inside the pen. She had Pell's description of the route to June's place memorized in the kind of detail that would hold under the specific impairment of moving fast through dark on cold ground in an emergency. She had talked to Bruno about what she needed from him. Not that she was certain how much he understood, but he'd listened with his ears forward, and she'd decided he understood enough. Stubborn went into labor on a Tuesday night in the last week of March. Maribel had been half expecting it. She'd checked on the ewes before bed, and Stubborn had been standing in the corner with her head low, which was different, and she'd set herself to wake at midnight. She woke at 11:30 by the particular alarm system she'd developed over winter, which was Bruno standing on the floor beside her pallet and breathing differently than he breathed in his sleep. She was in the pen in 5 minutes. Stubborn was down, which was normal, and working through contractions with the focused, inward expression of an animal that has tuned out everything that isn't the immediate biological imperative. Maribel crouched beside her with the lantern and ran through what June had told her. Watch for position. Watch for duration, watch for distress that was different from effort. She had been told she would know the difference, and had been skeptical of this at the time, and was unsurprised to discover that June had been right. The difference, when she was actually in the pen watching Stubborn work, was obvious in a way that no amount of description would have made it obvious beforehand. Everything was in the right position. She stayed beside Stubborn for 4 hours. At just after 3 in the morning, by the thin light of her lantern, Stubborn produced a lamb. Then, 20 minutes later, she produced another one. Maribel sat back on her heels in the cold pen and looked at 2 small wet creatures that were already attempting to stand, with the extravagant optimism of newborns, on legs that hadn't found their arrangement yet. She did not cry. She did make a sound that was not quite a word, and that Bruno, from the pen gate where she'd put him to keep him from being too much in the middle of things, responded to with a single quiet whoof. "I know," she said. The second ewe, Patience, produced twins 4 days later, which Maribel assisted more confidently than she'd assisted Stubborn's birth, both because she'd done it once now, and because Patience was, true to her name, less dramatic about the whole thing. Contrary waited another week, and then produced a single large lamb that arrived with such a no-nonsense lack of complication that Maribel was almost embarrassed by how much she'd prepared. 5 lambs in 11 days, all of them alive. All of them nursing. She sent Bruno to June Curran with a note tied to his collar that said, 5. All well. Thank you. He came back the next morning with a note that said, Good work. Come visit when you're through the worst of it. JC. The worst of it was the first 2 weeks, when the lambs needed watching around the clock and the pen needed constant cleaning and the ewes needed extra feed and water to support nursing, and Maribel was running on the kind of intermittent sleep that doesn't fully restore anything but keeps you functional if you manage it carefully. She'd dealt with this kind of sleep deficit before. The last months of Thomas's illness had been something like this. The constant half-alertness of someone who knows they might need to wake at any moment. And her body had a memory for it, a grim competence that kicked in and carried her through when willpower alone wasn't sufficient. The lambs grew fast. Lambs always do, but it still surprised her. The speed of them, the way an animal that was a staggering wet confusion on Tuesday was a sturdy, assertive presence by the following Monday. Stubborn's twins were a ram and a ewe. Both gray like their mother, both with her particular energy, which in a lamb looked like constant motion, and in an adult sheep she now understood was a form of opinion. Patience's twins were both ewes, pale-faced and calm. Contrary's single lamb was a large male, brown-faced, who had arrived looking competent and continued in that vein. She looked at them in the pen on a morning in mid-April when the sun was actually warm for the first time since October, lying on her face and arms as she leaned on the rail, and she thought about the brown wrapping paper with its columns of figures, and she revised the numbers upward in her head. Pell came to see the lambs on a Saturday, the first Saturday in April that the ridge road was clear enough for a cart. He stood at the pen rail and looked at 5 lambs and 3 healthy ewes in an enclosure that had survived a historic blizzard and a cracked post and a mountain lion and the general intention of the winter to defeat everything it encountered. And he said, "Huh." "Huh," Maribel agreed. 5. 5. He was quiet for a while. "Wool clip's going to be good this summer. If I can find a shearer." "I know a shearer. I'll send word." He turned from the pen and looked at the cave entrance, at the gate with her name on it, at the property that had been on the county books for 6 years and was now, unmistakably, someone's home. "Silas Whitmore sent a second letter," he said. She had been waiting for this. "Through the same solicitor?" "Different one. Renwick County solicitor declined to send a second inquiry, apparently. This one's from a firm in the capital. Capital solicitors cost more money than county solicitors, which meant Silas was treating this as a serious matter now, rather than a routine acquisition. She thought about what had changed in his calculation since the first letter. The blizzard, which had cost him 11 head, which had made water rights, reliable spring water on elevated ground, worth considerably more than they'd been worth in December. The spring at Raven Bluff had been running strong all winter without interruption. She'd checked it every day. It had never faltered. "What's the offered price?" she asked. $120. $120 was more money than she'd seen at one time in her entire life. She thought about what $120 would mean, what it could buy, what it could secure, what pressure it could remove. She thought about it honestly, the way you have to think about things when you're not pretending to be stronger than you are. Then she thought about the spring, about the pen, about 5 lambs on the other side of that rail, about a cabin she'd built with her own hands inside a mountain, while a man in town, with expensive boots, waited for her to come back and admit she'd been wrong to try. "No," she said. Pell nodded. He'd expected this. "He's not going to stop." "I know." She looked at the cave. "Pell, is there a lawyer in this territory who works for a flat fee? Not a retainer, not a percentage. A flat fee for specific work." He thought about it. "There's a woman in Caldwell, about 30 miles east, Ida Marsh. She set up practice there about 2 years ago. I've heard she's competent and she charges fairly. Can you get me an introduction? I can write a letter." He wrote the letter that afternoon in the back of the trading post in his spare, precise handwriting. Maribel drove to Caldwell the following week, leaving Bruno with the ewes and the lambs and a clear conscience about the arrangement, because Bruno's herding instinct extended to general guardianship, and she trusted him with the pen more than she trusted most people with anything. Ida Marsh's office was above the hardware store on Caldwell's main street. She was a small woman with quick, dark eyes and a desk that was very organized in a way that suggested not tidiness for its own sake, but the specific organization of someone who handles many things simultaneously and cannot afford to misplace any of them. She read Pell's letter, looked at Maribel, and asked to see the deed. Maribel had brought it. She handed it across the desk. Ida Marsh read it carefully, which took about 3 minutes, and then she read it again, which took two more. She had a way of reading that involved complete stillness, which Maribel found reassuring in a lawyer. "This is clean," she said. "The county sale was properly executed. The title is clear, no encumbrances, no prior claims." Can Silas Whitmore challenge it? He can challenge anything. Anyone can challenge anything if they're willing to pay lawyers enough money. Ida set the deed down. What he can't do is win a challenge, because there's nothing here to challenge. The sale was legal, the price was accepted, the deed is registered. Unless he can demonstrate fraud or coercion in the original sale, and he cannot because there wasn't any, there's no legal pathway to take this property from you against your will. "He has more money than I do," Maribel said. "He could drag it out." "He could. That's a real concern." Ida looked at her steadily. "What I can do, for a flat fee of $15, is write a formal legal response to any inquiry from any solicitor representing Whitmore, establishing clearly that the property is not for sale, that any attempt to contest the title will be met with a counterfiling, and that any harassment of the owner, including repeated unsolicited purchase offers through legal representatives, may constitute grounds for a complaint to the county land office." She paused. "It's mostly language, but language matters when the other side has lawyers." $15, Maribel said. "Flat. No further charge unless something actually goes to filing, which it won't, because what I'm describing will make pursuing this more trouble than it's worth, even for a man with Whitmore's resources." Maribel had $15. She had earned it through the first quilt sales from Marjorie Odell, which had come through Pell's shop in February and March. Slow money, but real money. The first money she had made entirely by her own arrangements since she'd moved to the cave. She had been holding it against spring expenses. She thought about what the $15 would buy in other terms. Then she said, "Do it." Ida Marsh wrote the letter while Maribel waited. It took her 40 minutes, and when she read it aloud for Maribel's understanding, it was the most precise and deliberate document Maribel had ever heard. Not aggressive, not combative, but absolutely clear in the way of something that has been constructed specifically to leave no room for misinterpretation. She drove back to Raven Bluff feeling something she hadn't felt in the months since Thomas died. Something that had to do with having a defense that wasn't just her own stubbornness. Her stubbornness had been sufficient so far, but it was good to have something behind it. The letter went out through Pell's contact in the capital the following week. She didn't hear anything back from Silas's direction for almost 3 weeks, which she took to mean the letter had landed with the weight Ida Marsh had intended. Spring moved in properly through April. The snow left the valley floor first, then retreated up the ridge, and the scrub vegetation that she'd assumed was purely gray and dead began to show, improbably, flecks of green at its base. Not abundant growth. Not anything you'd mistake for lushness, but alive. The juniper bushes that grew sideways out of the rock face put out new tips, the pale green of new growth against the older dark, and the ridge itself changed character in the early morning light, losing the stark quality it had all winter and becoming something more complicated and, she thought, more honest. The lambs went out into the wider enclosure for the first time on a warm day in late April. She'd extended the pen in early April, using timber she'd bought with quilt money and the last of Pell's credit, adding another 20 feet to the south side, and incorporating a section of the flat-cleared area she'd made outside the cave entrance in her first week. The lamb's first experience of the extended space was one of the most purely entertaining things she had witnessed in months. 5 small animals discovering that there was more room than they'd understood, and responding to this information with an energy that suggested they'd been conserving it specifically for this purpose. Even Stubborn's twins, who had their mother's opinionated quality in miniature, simply ran. She watched them from the pen gate with Bruno beside her and felt, for the first time since she'd driven away from the Whitmore house with Thomas's letters in a muddy box, something that was not the dogged forward motion of survival, but something more like ease. Not happiness exactly. Happiness felt too simple for what she'd been through to arrive at this moment. But ease. The specific ease of a person who has survived something difficult enough that survival itself becomes a kind of satisfaction. She did not let it make her careless. There was too much still to do. The wool clip was in June. The shearer Pell had found was a man named Arvis who traveled a circuit through the territory with his own equipment and charged by the animal, and did not comment on anything he saw at any of the properties he worked, which was either professionalism or a survival strategy developed over years of entering strangers' lives for a few hours and needing to be invited back. He came to Raven Bluff on a Wednesday in early June, looked at the cave and the pen and the lambs and the setup she'd built, said nothing about any of it, and sheared her 8 animals, 3 ewes and 5 lambs that had grown enough wool to merit it, with a speed and economy that she watched carefully because she intended to learn from it. She couldn't afford him indefinitely. Eventually, she'd need to learn to do this herself or find a cheaper arrangement. "How long did it take you to learn?" she asked him, watching how he held the ewe's legs and the angle of his shearing hand. He glanced up. "Long time. You thinking of learning?" "I'm thinking I should know how." He was quiet for a moment, working. "I could show you the basics while I'm here. What to do and what not to do. You'd need a lot of practice before you're good at it." "That's fine." He showed her. Spent an extra hour at Raven Bluff walking her through the technique on the last 2 animals, and she was slow and imprecise and had to stop twice when she felt the shears snag and needed to reconsider her angle, and he corrected her 3 times without impatience and once with a specific instruction about wrist position that she could feel the difference of immediately. The wool she got was not a large amount. 8 animals, some of them young, in the first year of what she hoped would be a growing enterprise. It was not the volume that would make her wealthy or even comfortable, but it was real wool, clean and well kept because she'd maintained the animals through a hard winter. And Pell told her it was better quality than what many of the larger operations around Harrow's Creek were bringing in that summer, because those flocks had been stressed by the blizzard and stress showed in wool. She got a fair price. Better than fair, by the standards of what she'd calculated on the brown wrapping paper. She paid off her debt to Pell the first Saturday in July. She put the money on his counter, all of it, every cent she owed, organized, and he counted it and looked at her and said, "You know you didn't have to do it all at once." "I know." He put the money in his strongbox. He did not make a production of it, which was the correct response because she hadn't done it for the production. She'd done it because owing Pell Garrity was the one obligation that had sat in her chest every day since October, not with shame, but with the specific discomfort of a good woman who doesn't like being beholden to anyone, even someone who has been genuinely decent to her. "I want to add animals," she said, "this fall. I want to buy 4 more ewes and another ram, and I want to breed them before winter." Pell looked at her. 4 more ewes is real money." "I know. I have it." She paused. "Some of it. I have enough for 3 ewes. I need credit for the 4th and the ram. Or I need to find someone to trade with." He thought about it. Garrity had a good breeding season. She might want to sell a few animals at the end of summer to thin the flock before winter feed costs go up. "I'll talk to her." "And Odell's Ramshut, I'll talk to him too." She looked at Pell directly. "I want to be at 12 breeding ewes by next spring. That's what I need to make this work without credit. 12 ewes with lambs and wool at the current prices. I've done the numbers. 12 gives me the margin." Pell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll front you the 4th ewe. I'll pay it back before fall." "I know you will." She walked out of the trading post into the July sun and stood on the street for a moment, squinting. It was the first time she'd been in Harrow's Creek in the full heat of summer, and the town looked different than it had in the gray months. Louder, more populated, the hitching posts full, and the general store doing the kind of business it only did in the warm season when people could move freely. She heard someone say her name. She turned. It was one of the women who had watched from across the road the morning Silas threw her coat in the mud. A woman named Cora Denton, wife of one of the Denton brothers, whose chicken flock had died in the blizzard. Cora was looking at her with an expression that was nothing like the expression she'd had across the road in October, the careful uninvolvement. This expression was more direct, more uncertain, carrying the particular quality of a person who has decided to do something that makes them a little nervous. "Maribel," Cora said again, coming closer. We heard about your lambs, about all of them coming through the winter." "Yes," Maribel said. "My husband lost half his stock. The blizzard—" Cora stopped. Tried again. "We were wondering, some of us, whether you'd be willing to talk to Harold about what you did, how you kept them alive. He's trying to rebuild the flock and he doesn't want another winter like—" "Tell Harold to come see me," Maribel said. "He's welcome out to the ridge." Cora looked surprised. Maybe she'd expected resistance or a reminder of October. "Really?" "Yes. Maribel paused. I'll need to know what setup he has. Shelter, water source, feed situation. Tell him to come when he has time. Thank you. Cora said it with a feeling behind it. I know we weren't. Come see the lambs, Maribel said. Bring your children if you have them. They'll enjoy the lambs. She said it not unkindly, but not with the specific warmth that would have required her to pretend October hadn't happened. She was not that generous. She was generous enough to move forward, and that was what she had. Cora Denton nodded and said she would, and Maribel walked back to her cart. It was on that same street, 20 minutes later, while she was loading supplies into the cart from the general store, that she heard a voice she recognized from a frequency in her nervous system rather than from her ears. Maribel. She did not turn immediately. She finished stowing the sack she was holding, placed it with both hands in the cart bed, and then turned. Silas Whitmore was standing on the boardwalk outside the land office. He was wearing his good coat despite the July heat, which told her this was deliberate, that he had dressed for this encounter the way men dress when they want to be imposing. He was 62 years old and still large, still carrying the physical authority he'd had his whole life. But there was something different about him that she noticed and spent half a second identifying. He looked tired. Not the tired of a man who had had a hard season, but the tired of a man who had been certain of something and had discovered, slowly, that his certainty was costing him more than he'd budgeted for. She walked to within comfortable speaking distance and stopped. Silas, she said. He looked at her the same way he'd always looked at her. The top-down assessment, the ledger-reading look. But the calculation behind it was different now. She could feel it. I heard you came through the winter, he said. I did. Lost 11 head myself. He said this as if he expected a response and wasn't sure what it would be. I heard that, she said. I'm sorry. He studied her face, apparently trying to determine if she meant it. She did mean it. She was not a woman who enjoyed other people's losses, not even his. He had wronged her badly, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she wasn't going to perform pleasure at his livestock dying in a blizzard. The letter from your lawyer, he said. What about it? It was strongly worded. It was accurate, she said. The property is not for sale. I thought a letter was a cleaner way to say that than a conversation in the street. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something working in his face that she couldn't entirely read. Several things at once, the way complicated men's faces are when they're standing in front of a situation they didn't write the script for. The spring, he said. I need water access on the north side of the territory. My north grazing land has no reliable source, and I lost animals this winter, partly because the distance to water in those conditions. He stopped, seemed to reassemble himself. I'm asking whether there's a water access arrangement possible. Not buying the land, just rights to the spring. She had not expected this. She looked at him and thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything now. Not from the first feeling, which was complex and loud, but from the practical reality. Silas Whitmore was asking her for something. He was standing on a street in the town where he had thrown her into the mud and asking her for something, and the asking was costing him something she could see on his face, even though he was working to keep it off. No, she said. He blinked. The price? It's not about price. She kept her voice even. The spring is my primary water source. My flock depends on it and it's going to grow. I can't commit spring access to outside use and protect my animals at the same time. She paused. But you could dig. The aquifer that feeds my spring runs under most of the North Ridge. A well, deep enough, on your north grazing land. You'd likely hit it. Your own access, your own source. He stared at her. How do you know where the aquifer runs? I've been paying attention to the ridge for 9 months, she said. The spring seep pattern, the rock layer it comes from, the angle of the strata. I've looked at it carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that kind of knowledge costs money. Yes, she said. It usually does. There was a silence between them that had more in it than either of them was going to say out loud. 9 months of history. Thomas's grave still new enough to show its outline. A muddy coat and a box of letters. $40 offered and refused, and then $120 offered and refused, and now this. A man who had never once called her by her name asking her for the thing she had that he needed. She waited. What would you want? He said finally, for the information about the aquifer. She had thought about this for approximately 30 seconds total, which was not enough time and also exactly enough time, because some things you know before you know them. Written confirmation, she said, that you have no claim on Raven Bluff property. No challenge to the title, no further solicitor letters, no assertion of any kind of historical access right or prior claim. Signed, witnessed, filed with the county land office. He went very still. That's not... It's exactly what I said. Written and filed. In exchange for which I'll give you a full accounting of what I know about the North Ridge Aquifer, which is enough to locate a well site with reasonable confidence. She looked at him steadily. You'd need a surveyor to confirm it. I'd recommend one anyway, but it would give you a starting point and likely save considerable money in trial drilling. You want me to sign away any claim? You have no valid claim. Your lawyer knows this. Ida Marsh's letter made this clear. She kept her voice free of the satisfaction that was pressing against her ribs. I'm asking you to put in writing what is already legally true, in exchange for information that has real value to you. She paused one beat. It's a fair trade, Silas. It was the first time she had ever said his name without the formal address. She watched him register it. He looked at her for a long time. Behind him on the street, Harrow's Creek went about its business. People moving, horses standing, the general commerce of a summer afternoon in a small town. And none of it paid particular attention to this conversation between a large man in a good coat and a plus-size widow by a supply cart. But she paid attention to it. Every word, every silence. She had earned this, not by wanting it, but by doing the thing that made it possible. By surviving the winter, keeping the animals alive, building the cabin, bracing the post, driving the mountain lion out of the recess with sound and stubbornness, refusing the $40 and the $120, paying Pell back, learning to shear, sending the legal letter, expanding the pen and buying more animals, and standing on her own land until standing on her own land became the most natural thing in the world. She had earned this moment by making herself impossible to dismiss. I'll need to talk to my lawyer, Silas said. Of course. This week. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He held her gaze for another second, and she saw it, the thing she'd been waiting to see, the thing she'd promised herself on the morning he threw her coat into the mud. The moment a man who has been wrong about something understands that he has been wrong. It was not dramatic, it was barely visible. Just a shift in the set of his jaw, something going out of his face that had been in it the entire time she'd known him, a certainty draining away the way water drains from a crack in stone. Slowly, completely, leaving only the shape of where it had been. He turned and walked back toward the land office without another word. She stood beside her cart for a moment, her hand on the sideboard, and breathed. Harold Denton came to Raven Bluff the following Saturday, as Cora had promised. He was a quiet man, practical and unassuming, who walked around the pen and the cave entrance and the cabin setup with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man doing honest arithmetic. She explained what she'd done with the water system, the way she'd managed feed through the worst of the winter, the doubled canvas on the pen, the importance of a proper roof, the bracing method she'd used when the post cracked. He asked good questions. She answered them directly. At the end of it, he stood at the pen rail looking at her lambs, which were no longer small enough to be charming in a helpless way, but had arrived at the awkward middle phase of young sheep, all legs and curiosity. You did all this, he said, alone. Bruno helped, she said. He looked at Bruno, who was sitting at the base of the slope doing his habitual surveillance of everything on the property. That's a good dog, he said. He is. Harold turned back to the lambs. My grandfather would have said you've got the gift for it. Animals. I just paid attention, she said. That might be the same thing, he said. He drove back down the ridge road in the late afternoon, and she watched him go and then turned back to the pen and leaned on the rail the way she did every evening, watching the animals move in the late light. 5 lambs, 3 ewes, a spring that ran clean through the hardest winter in years, a deed in a cabin, a legal letter in the county land office, a man who had thrown her coat in the mud now wanting her signature. She reached over and scratched Stubborn between the ears. Stubborn tolerated this for about 3 seconds before moving away, which was the longest she'd ever allowed it, and Maribel thought, progress. Bruno came and sat beside her at the rail. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and the shadow came off the rock and moved across the valley, and the lambs settled, and the ewes settled, and the cave behind her held its temperature the way it always had, the way it would keep doing, deep and permanent, and utterly indifferent to the opinion of the town below. She had written back to Ida Marsh the week before, updating her on Silas's approach in the street. Ida's reply had been brief. Stay patient. Let him come to you. He will. He had. And when his lawyer's letter arrived the following Thursday, formal, stilted, proposing the title waiver in exchange for the aquifer information exactly as she'd outlined, she read it twice and then set it on the table next to Thomas's box, which she still kept, which she would always keep, and she thought about Thomas, who had been decent and imperfect, and who had believed until the end that his family would look after her. His family had not looked after her. She had looked after herself, which turned out to be more reliable. She picked up her pencil and the brown wrapping paper, now extended to 3 pages, and she began to update the numbers for the fall purchase. 4 more U's. She had enough now, without Pell's credit, and a conversation with Odell about the ram, and a serious consideration of whether the cave's east extension, which she'd been sketching in her head for 2 months, could be started before winter. The numbers said yes. Not comfortably, not without careful management, not without the kind of precise attention to every expenditure that she'd been living with since October. But yes, she folded the wrapping paper carefully and put it in the wooden box next to Thomas's letters, where she kept the things that mattered, and she went to stoke the stove for the evening. Outside, the summer dark settled over Raven Bluff. The cave breathed around her, quiet and solid and entirely hers. Silas Whitmore's lawyer came to Raven Bluff on a Tuesday morning in late July, which was not something Maribel had expected. She'd anticipated a letter, more formal language, more careful hedging. But instead she came out of the pen after the morning feed to find a man on a good horse at her gate, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the particular expression of a professional who has been sent somewhere he finds mildly beneath him but is too disciplined to say so. His name was Forsyth. He had good manners and careful eyes, and he presented the title waiver document across her kitchen table. The table she'd built from the last 2 pieces of scrap timber in April, slightly uneven on one leg, shimmed with a folded piece of leather, with the professional neutrality of a man delivering a business transaction rather than a concession. She read the document twice. Then she read it a 3rd time because she'd learned, in the months since Thomas died, that reading things twice was often not enough when the other side had better lawyers than you. It said what she'd asked for, all of it. No challenge to the title, no assertion of prior claim, no further contact through legal representatives regarding the purchase or acquisition of the Raven Bluff property. Signed by Silas Whitmore, witnessed, with a copy to be filed at the county land office. She looked up at Forsyth. Has this been filed yet? It will be filed upon your signature and delivery of the information. I'll sign after it's filed, not before. Forsyth looked at her with the slight recalibration of a man who had expected a different response. That's not the standard arrangement. I understand that. It's my arrangement. She kept her voice even. File the document. Bring me the land office receipt. I'll give you the aquifer information the same day. He thought about this for a moment. Mr. Whitmore can want what he likes, she said, not unkindly. I'll wait. Forsyth went away without the information and came back 4 days later with the land office receipt. She looked at it carefully. The date stamp, the clerk's signature, the registration number. And then she got the brown wrapping paper from the wooden box and turned it over to its blank side and drew him a diagram. The ridge profile, the rock strata she'd identified, the spring emergence point, the angle and depth at which the aquifer appeared to run, based on everything she'd observed over 10 months of watching water move through stone. She was not a geologist. She said so. You'll need a surveyor to verify this before you spend money on drilling. Mr. Whitmore is aware. I'm saying it for your record, she said, so there's no misunderstanding later about what I represented and what I didn't. Forsyth looked at the diagram, folded it carefully, put it in his satchel. He stood to go. At the door of the cabin he paused, which surprised her. He hadn't struck her as a man who paused. He told me, Forsyth said, when he sent me out here, that he expected the property to be in worse condition. He said it without inflection, but there was something under it that she couldn't entirely read. I told him I'd report what I found. And what did you find? She asked. He looked at her steadily. A well-managed operation, he said. For the record. He left. She stood in the cabin doorway and watched him ride down the ridge road and through the gate, and she thought about the phrase, a well-managed operation, and thought about the fact that it was the most straightforward professional assessment anyone had offered her since she'd moved to Raven Bluff, and it had come from Silas Whitmore's own lawyer. She went back inside and looked at the land office receipt for a while longer than was strictly necessary. Then she put it in the wooden box with Thomas's letters and the brown wrapping paper and the note from Ida Marsh, and went out to check on the lambs. The summer that followed was the hardest kind of hard. Not the dramatic hard of blizzards and cracked posts and mountain lions, but the sustained, grinding hard of too much work for one person, day after day, in heat rather than cold. She sheared the ewes herself for the first time in August, working from memory and the corrections Arvis had given her in June. It took her 3 times as long as it had taken him, and the result was uneven in places. She could feel where she'd gone too shallow and where she'd corrected too aggressively. But the wool came off clean and the animals were not injured. And when she was finished, she sat on the floor of the pen and looked at her hands for a long time. They were not the hands she'd had a year ago. A year ago, her hands had been capable but soft, the hands of a woman who worked but not like this. These hands had calluses in places she hadn't known could callus, and a scar on the left palm from where she'd slipped with the pry bar in January, and the particular worn quality of things that have been used at full capacity for an extended period. She was 30 years old. She had been 30 for 3 weeks and had not thought about it until just now. She thought, I am not who I was when I was 29. She wasn't sure yet exactly who she was now. She had an idea, the rough outline of a person she hadn't finished becoming, and she thought she might not finish becoming her for a long time yet, and that was fine. That was probably right. The 4 new ewes arrived in September. She'd gone to Garrity herself, without Pell as intermediary, and had negotiated the price directly, which went better than she'd expected, partly because she knew more now. About animals, about what to look for, about what questions to ask. And Garrity was the kind of woman who responded to competence with more respect than she responded to anything else. They'd sat on Garrity's porch and looked at the candidates and argued mildly about 2 of them and agreed on the other 3, and the 4th Garrity threw in at a reduced rate because, she said, the ewe was 7 years old and she didn't want to winter her, and Maribel's cave setup was the best chance the animal had of making it through another season. I heard about your blizzard winter, Garrity said. All 5 lambs alive. All 5? Garrity nodded slowly, the nod of a woman calibrating a revised estimate. What are you up to now, flock size? 8 breeding ewes after these, 5 young animals. Maribel paused. I want 12 breeding ewes by spring. Garrity looked at her for a long moment. You're serious about this? I've been serious since October. I know, seriously serious, building something. Yes. Garrity rocked once in her chair. I might have a business proposition for you. Not now. Next spring, when I see how your winter goes. She said it carefully, the way practical people float ideas they're not ready to fully commit to. I've been thinking about selling direct to the capital, skipping the Harrows Creek middlemen, but I don't have enough volume alone to make the trip worth the freight cost. Maribel looked at her. You'd need someone to combine with. Someone with good wool and healthy animals, and the sense to keep them that way. Garrity's eyes were direct and assessing and entirely free of the condescension Maribel had gotten used to fending off. Think about it. She thought about it the whole drive home. Odell's ram came back to Raven Bluff in October, this time with a different arrangement. Marjorie Odell had sold enough quilts through Pell's shop by now that the relationship had settled into something more like a partnership than a transaction, and the ram's fee was covered by the ongoing quilt arrangement plus a small cash portion that Maribel paid without blinking because she could, which was a sentence she still had trouble believing she could construct honestly. She was expanding the cave's east extension before winter. She'd started it in late August, a widening of the natural alcove on the east side of the main cave chamber, supported by timber posts she'd set in the rock floor using a method she'd worked out with Pell over 2 visits, involving iron anchors and a kind of bracing she'd never seen done, but had reasoned through from first principles. The extension would give her another 20 feet of protected space, enough to bring the entire flock inside if a blizzard came again, which she was planning for as a matter of course, rather than as a remote possibility. The work was slow. She had limited hours in the day, and the rock resisted her in ways that wood and soil did not. But it moved. June Curran came to see it in September. She drove out on a clear afternoon, tied her horse at the gate, and walked up the path with the careful footing of a woman who has spent 60 years being sensible about her joints. Maribel met her at the entrance and led her through the cave. The main chamber, the cabin, the spring, the new east extension with its timber supports and raw rock walls. And June walked through it all without speaking, the way she'd taught Maribel to think through problems, methodically and without premature conclusion. At the end, standing at the spring, she said, "You put the support posts at 3-foot spacing. 2.5 on the end nearest the weight-bearing overhang," Maribel said. June looked at the overhang. "That's right," she said. "I wouldn't have thought of that." It was, Maribel understood, a significant statement from June Curran. They had tea in the cabin. Real tea, not the dried herb approximation she'd been making all winter, but actual tea from Pell's shop, a small luxury she'd started permitting herself in August. They sat on either side of the small table and drank it, and June asked questions about the flock's health, and Maribel answered them, and it was the easiest conversation she could remember having in over a year. The specific ease of talking to someone who is genuinely interested in the thing you're talking about and has the knowledge to engage with it seriously. "You're going to have a real operation here in 2 years," June said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an assessment, offered the way June offered everything, as factual observation. "That's what I'm planning for," Maribel said. June looked at her across the table. "After Thomas died," she said, "did anyone—" She stopped, started differently. "People in that town treated you badly." It was not a question. "Some of them," Maribel said. "And Silas?" "Yes." June was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup in her hands. "My husband died 11 years ago," she said. "People treated me differently than they treated the men around me. Not cruelly, most of them, just differently. Like I'd become a different category of person." She paused. "It made me angry for a long time." Maribel looked at her. "Are you still angry?" "Sometimes," June said. "Less than I used to be. Mostly because I got too busy to maintain it at full strength." She set her cup down. "What about you?" Maribel thought about this honestly, the way June deserved to be thought about. "I'm still angry about some of it," she said. "The coat in the mud. I don't think I'll ever not be angry about the coat in the mud." June nodded. "You shouldn't be," she said. "Some things you stay angry about. That's not the same as letting it run you." "No," Maribel agreed. "It's not." The second autumn was different from the first in ways that were both practical and harder to quantify. The practical differences were visible: 8 breeding ewes instead of 3, 5 young animals approaching their first winter, a cave that had been reinforced and extended, firewood stacked deeper and earlier, food stores that didn't require careful rationing, water system improvements she'd made through the summer that eliminated the ice problem she'd fought every morning in January. She'd also bought a rifle, a second-hand one, nothing impressive, but functional and properly maintained, and she'd spent 3 Saturdays in August learning to use it with reasonable competence, which she defined as being able to hit what she aimed at from a distance sufficient to be useful, which was all she needed it to be. The harder to quantify differences were in how the territory treated her. It had happened gradually, the way most real changes happen. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of small shifts that added up to something different when you looked at the sum rather than any individual part. Harold Denton had come back twice with specific questions and had taken her answers seriously and had implemented what she'd suggested and had come back to tell her the results, which was a form of respect she hadn't realized she'd missed until she had it again. Cora Denton had brought her children to see the lambs in May, as she'd said she would, and the children had been charmed, and Cora had looked at the pen and the cave and the whole setup with an expression that Maribel recognized as revised understanding, the look of a person who has been carrying a wrong assessment and has finally let it go. There were others. A man named Beauchamp, who raised goats on the territory's southern edge and came to ask about her water system, which he wanted to adapt for his own situation. A young couple named Prentice, who had taken up a homestead that winter and were struggling with the cold, who drove out in November and stayed for 2 hours while Maribel walked them through everything she knew about insulating a structure in the territory's conditions. She charged the Prentices nothing. She also gave them a bundle of the clay tallow mix she'd perfected over 2 winters, with instructions for its use, and sent them back down the ridge road with it tied behind their cart, and the specific feeling of someone passing along knowledge that had cost them real things to acquire. Pell noticed. "You're becoming the person people ask," he said one Saturday in November, over the counter of the trading post. "People need practical information," she said. "They've always needed practical information. They're asking you for it now." She thought about what had changed, and the honest answer was, she had survived things that the people asking her hadn't survived. And survival in the territory was its own credential. Nobody asked her about books or propriety or whether she was appropriate company. They asked her about water systems and winter feed ratios and structural reinforcement and predator management, and she answered them. And the answers were useful, which was the only credential that mattered out here. She was not entirely comfortable with the attention. There was something in being asked for, being sought out, that sat slightly at odds with the long stretch of being invisible she'd come through. Not the comfortable invisibility of someone who doesn't need to be seen, but the painful invisibility of someone who is present and simply not regarded. The transition between those two states was not seamless. She was still learning to receive acknowledgement without either deflecting it awkwardly or holding it too tight, and she suspected she'd be learning that for a while yet. The title waiver document stayed in the wooden box next to Thomas's letters and the aquifer diagram she'd made a copy of before giving the original to Forsyth. She looked at it sometimes, not often. It represented something specific, not a victory exactly, because victory implied a kind of clean conclusion that her life didn't have, but a resolution. A settled question. The thing Silas Whitmore had wanted from her and the thing she'd wanted from him had both been transferred properly and legally, and what remained was the space that had been occupied by that unfinished business, which was now available for other uses. She thought about Thomas more in the second year than she had in the first, which surprised her. In the first year, she'd been too busy surviving to think about much beyond the next problem, and Thomas had existed mostly as a background presence, the source of the situation she was in. In the second year, with slightly more room to think, she found him appearing in her mind more specifically. Not his death, not the illness, but Thomas as he'd been before all of that. The way he'd laughed, which was a full sound that surprised people who didn't know him. The way he'd called her mare when they were alone, which she'd pretended to find annoying and actually liked. The decency of him, which was genuine even when it was limited. She missed him with a feeling that had changed in character, less sharp than it had been in the early months, but wider somehow, more present in the ordinary moments. She missed him on evenings when she had something worth telling someone. She missed him when a lamb did something funny and there was nobody to turn to. She did not miss him in a way that stopped her doing anything, which she thought he would have wanted, and which she had arrived at not by deciding to be strong, but by having too much work to do and too much at stake to let grief have more than its portion of her time. She did not know if she would ever marry again. She was 30 years old and a property owner, and a person of some standing in the territory's practical community. And she thought about this occasionally in the evenings, the way you think about an open question you haven't formed enough of an opinion on to answer. She was not lonely in the way she'd been in the first weeks in the cave, when loneliness had been a physical pressure. She had Bruno, who was as good company as most people, and she had the animals, and she had June Curran, who came for tea every few weeks and talked to her as an equal, and she had Pell and his reliable, honest assessments, and she had the territory's growing sense of her as someone worth talking to. It was not a full life in the sense of the life she might have planned at 25, but it was hers, which was a thing that turned out to matter more than the plans. The second blizzard came in February, 2 years after the first. Not as large, not as sustained, but serious. 3 days of driving cold and significant snow accumulation, and the kind of wind that finds everything you thought was sealed. She was ready for it in ways she hadn't been ready for the first one, which didn't mean it wasn't hard. Hard and ready are not mutually exclusive states. She spent 3 days managing the flock, running checks every 3 hours, keeping the stove running, dealing with a section of the East Extension's roof that collected snow weight faster than she'd calculated and needed to be cleared twice. She slept in short intervals and ate when she remembered to, and kept Bruno inside because the visibility outside was poor enough that even Bruno's nose and sense of direction couldn't fully compensate. When it passed, she had 13 animals, all of them alive. She stood at the cave entrance on the morning after the blizzard broke, looking out at the white-covered valley, and she felt the echo of what she'd felt after the first blizzard, the relief, the accumulated weight releasing. But it was smaller this time, not because this winter had been easier, but because some portion of her had stopped being surprised by her own ability to come through. That was the thing nobody had told her about surviving something hard. You don't become fearless. You become acquainted with what you can do. And that acquaintance changes the flavor of the fear from something that stops you into something that simply accompanies you while you do the thing anyway. Garrity came in March, as she'd said she would. She drove up the Ridge Road in the first week that it was passable and sat in the cabin with tea and proposed the arrangement she'd outlined the previous September. A combined sale to the capital, wool and breeding stock, bypassing the Harrows Creek intermediaries who took a percentage that neither of them felt the need to keep paying. They negotiated for about an hour, not combatively, but seriously, because they were both serious people who understood that the terms you set at the beginning of something are the terms you live with, and it's better to be careful now than disappointed later. They reached an agreement that was fair to both of them and wrote it out in Maribel's handwriting on a fresh piece of paper, not the back of brown wrapping paper. She was past the brown wrapping paper stage now. She'd bought an actual ledger at Pell's in January, and they both signed it. Garrity looked around the cabin before she left. At the shelf with its organized supplies, the stove with its imperfectly angled pipe, the door that hung slightly off level because the frame had settled over 2 winters, and she hadn't yet got around to rehanging it, the wooden box on the table with Thomas's letters inside it. "You built this yourself," Garrity said. It was the same thing Harold Denton had said, but with a different quality. Harold had said it with wonder, and Garrity said it with recognition, the way one builder acknowledges another's work. "I built it myself," Maribel said. Garrity nodded once. "Good," she said, and left. That evening, Maribel sat at the table after supper with the ledger open in front of her and worked through the updated numbers, the real numbers, the numbers that included the Garrity arrangement and the spring wool clip and the projected lamb count and the feed costs and the ongoing maintenance of the east extension and the payment she still owed on the second-hand rifle. The numbers were not comfortable. Comfort in the financial sense was still a distance away, and she was honest with herself about that. But they were stable. They went in one direction. They showed a person who was building something real, slowly, on ground that she had made solid with her own hands. She closed the ledger and sat for a while in the quiet. Bruno was asleep in front of the stove, doing the heavy, unconscious breathing of a dog that has had a satisfactory day. Outside, the flock was settled in the extended pen. The spring ran in its channel along the cave floor, consistent and clean. The sound of it so familiar now that she only noticed it in moments like this, when she was quiet enough to hear everything. She thought about the morning Silas Whitmore threw her coat into the mud. She thought about the county clerk holding her $20 up to the light. She thought about Dolores Hatch's expression of pity barely concealed as concern, and the women across the road with their careful, uninvolved eyes, and Clarence Mull sitting on her windbreak stone with the easy confidence of a man who has never been required to consider the ownership of things he didn't already own. She thought about all of it, and then she let it sit where it sat. Not gone, not resolved into something painless, but in its proper place, which was the past, which was the country she'd come from, and not the one she was living in. The land that everyone had called worthless had turned out to be the most valuable thing she'd ever owned. Not because of the spring or the aquifer or the wool or even the 5 lambs that had come through the first blizzard, but because of what it had required of her to stay on it, what it had pulled out of her that she hadn't been sure was there, and what she'd discovered about the distance between what other people believe you're capable of and what you actually are. The distance, it turned out, could be enormous. She had not become someone she didn't recognize. She was still Maribel Rowan, still stubborn, still imperfect, still capable of waking at 3 in the morning, convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. Still sometimes resentful of things that deserved to be resented. Still missing Thomas on quiet evenings in ways she'd probably never entirely stop missing him. She had not been transformed by suffering into something pure and simple. She was the same complicated person, just harder in some ways and softer in others, and considerably more certain of what she was willing to do. What she had learned, and it was a thing she couldn't have been taught, only arrived at, was that the people who decide what you're worth in advance of watching you work are not authorities. They're just people with opinions and louder voices, and usually more money to amplify those voices. Their verdict is not binding. It never was. It only feels binding when you're standing in the mud with a wet coat and 32 cents and nowhere to go, And even then, even in that moment, it is not actually binding. You can just walk away from it. She had walked away from it, 4 miles up a ridge road to a rocky hillside with a cave that nobody wanted, and she had made it into something that she wanted, and that had turned out to be enough. More than enough. The fire in the stove settled with a small sound, the way fires do when they've found their rhythm, and the cave was warm around her, and Bruno breathed in his sleep, and outside the ridge stood in the dark, the way it had been standing for longer than any of them had been alive, and would keep standing long after all of them were gone. Maribel Rowan put her hand flat on the table, on the uneven table she'd built herself from the last pieces of timber she'd had, and felt the wood solid under her palm. She thought, I am still here. She thought, I built this. She thought, it's enough. And it was.